Demented inspirations. German reparations. Lenin was certainly right. There is no subtler, no surer means of overturning the existing basis of society than to debauch the currency. John Maynard Keynes, The Economic Consequences of the Peace. On November 11, 1918, the Great War came to an end as it had begun, as a total surprise. In June 1918, the German army broke through the Allied lines and came within 50 miles of Paris. The German public, given a distorted picture by its government, fully anticipated victory. A month later, the Allies counterattacked and suddenly the entire German war machine seemed to disintegrate. The German forces, exhausted by that last offensive, withered away. Support for the war at home crumbled. Civilian morale collapsed. Soldiers deserted in droves. The Navy, blockaded at Kiel, mutinied. And Germany's allies began to sue secretly for peace. By October, the military, desperate to salvage what it could, turned over power to the civilians. On November 9th, the Kaiser was forced into exile by his generals, boarding a train for Holland. Early on. November 11th, in a railway carriage in the forest of Compiègne 40 miles. Outside Paris, an armistice was signed. Across Europe, some 11 million men lay dead, including 2 million Germans, 1.4 million Frenchmen, and 900,000 British. Another 21 million had been wounded, very many maimed for life. 9 million civilians had perished, mostly of hunger, cold, or lowered resistance to the monstrous epidemics. But for all the horrendous human carnage, the actual material destruction of the war was limited to a long but narrow strip of northern France and Belgium. The costs of rebuilding the mines, farms, and factories destroyed on the Western Front amounted to only $7 billion. 1919–23. After the deluge, most European economies had contracted, Germany's and France's by 30%, Britain by less than 5%, as men and capital were siphoned off, as factories diverted to producing arms and livestock slaughtered. The war had been a boon for the United States. Entering late, it had suffered fewer casualties, while the massive expansion in exports of foodstuffs, raw materials, and war supplies to its allies had provided a gigantic boost to its economy. Before the war, its GDP of $40 billion per annum was roughly the equivalent of that of Britain, France, and Germany combined. By 1919, it was more than 50% larger. The most pernicious and insidious economic legacy of the war was the mountain of debt in Europe. In 4 years of constant and obsessive battle, the governments of Europe had spent some $200 billion, consuming almost half of their nation's GDP in mutual destruction. To pay for this, they had raised taxes, borrowed gigantic amounts of money both from their own citizens and from the Americans, and simply printed more and more currency. By the end of the war, Europe was awash with the stuff. The money supply in Britain doubled, in France it tripled, and in Germany, the worst culprit, it quadrupled. Though the U.S. money supply also doubled, this was less because of inflationary war finance, which it relied upon to a much smaller extent than the Europeans, and more because of the massive influx of gold. This set the pattern of the next decade. Europe struggling with the legacies and burdens of the past, the United States wrestling with the excess bonuses of its good fortune. On the day the Kaiser fled Germany, Schacht was in Berlin. That morning, although the Kaiser had not actually abdicated, and would only formally do so 2 weeks later from his sanctuary in Holland, the Chancellor, Prince Max of Baden, a distant cousin of the Kaiser's, announced preemptively that the Emperor had gone. The city was like an armed camp, with barbed wire entanglements and overturned vehicles blocking the streets. Revolution was in the air. A general strike had been declared, and thousands of workers and soldiers paraded through the center of town demanding a republic. Coming out of the Hotel Esplanade near the Potsdamer Platz at about noon, Schacht was confronted by a convoy of red soldiers packed in the back of trucks driving across the square. At the station, a machine gun company was positioned for action. No one seemed to be in charge. To find out what was going on, and to avoid being caught in the mob, Schacht and his companion headed north toward the Reichstag, which they found deserted. A little while before, Philip Scheidman, a leader of the Social Democrats, had given history a push by coming out onto the balcony and proclaiming a republic to the crowds below, although no such measure had been passed by the Reichstag. Thus was born the new Republic of Germany. The mobs had then headed off to the emperor's abandoned palace, the Berliner Schloss. Schacht would remark later that there was a certain distinctively German order amid all the chaos of that dramatic day. The imperial dynasty might have fallen and the political system of Germany overturned, but ordinary people went about their everyday business, trying to ignore the demonstrations. The trams did not stop running, electricity, water, and gas supplies were not interrupted, and almost no one was killed. The casualties that day amounted to fewer than 15 dead. Even when shots were randomly fired near the palace, the fleeing crowds remained so instinctively law-abiding that they obeyed the signs to keep off the grass. Across the country, workers' and soldiers' councils sprang up and took over the functions of the local authorities. On November 10th, Schacht was elected, much to his amusement, to his local community council. After issuing a proclamation welcoming the revolution, it met precisely once more. The next few weeks were a time of terrible turmoil. Although the November Revolution was largely peaceful, by the first weeks of January, violence had broken out and Berlin was racked by strikes, demonstrations, and fierce street fighting between the Spartacist revolutionaries and the army. It seemed to Schacht then, as to very many others, that Germany was the front line in a grand battle across Europe against the forces of Bolshevism. Going home through the darkened city, he could hear the rattle of machine guns. On one occasion, he was stuck in the Hotel Kaiserhof as a gang of Spartacist demonstrators clashed with a group of government supporters outside. A hand grenade burst among the crowd, scattering it in all directions and leaving one man dead in the street below. The fate of Germany hung by a thread, he recalled many years later. It was also, however, a time of opportunity for middle-class men of talent like Schacht. The collapse of empire and an army in defeat shattered the old order. Within 48 hours of the Kaiser's flight, 25 dynasties had abdicated within Germany. The Junkers who had dominated the country were discredited, their power swept away. Initially, Schacht thought he might find his opportunity in politics. Before the war, he had been a member of the Young Liberal Association, an arm of the National Liberals, a nationalistic though not very liberal party, which had enthusiastically supported the Kaiser's expansionist policies. In 1901, he had even declined an offer from the party to stand for election to the Reichstag, knowing that power in the Kaiserreich was reserved for the nobility, especially the Prussian nobility, and that a man of his background could not aspire to political office of any consequence. But with the new president of the Republic himself a former saddler, and the new chancellor a former journalist, it seemed that the old caste system had now disintegrated. On November 10th, the Republic only a day old, Schacht was invited to a meeting and asked to help found a new moderate party, the Deutsche Demokratische Partei, DDP, which would oppose alike the socialism of the left and the nationalism of the right. The DDP itself would briefly do very well, becoming a party of academics, journalists, and businessmen, many of them Jewish, and attracting such luminaries as Max Weber and Albert Einstein. In the 1919 election, it vaulted into third place in the Reichstag, after the Socialists and the Catholic Centrum Party. But Schacht's brief flirtation with democratic politics was not destined to be very successful. With his financial and business connections, he played an important role in raising funds for the DDP and helped write the party platform. But lacking the common touch that appealed to voters and too proud to forge the necessary personal alliances, he was never able to persuade a constituency to select him as a candidate. He was also viewed with some suspicion within the leadership, whose leading light, Theodor Wolff, editor of the Berliner Tageblatt, regarded him as just one more opportunist trying to hitch a ride on the cause of democracy, with little commitment to the new republic. For his part, Schacht would become steadily disillusioned with the party, formally breaking with it in 1925, when it voted to support the elimination of privy purses to the deposed ruling families. In the late 1920s, the DDP, like all German centrist parties, would shrink into insignificance, squeezed from both ends of the political spectrum, particularly from the right. By then, though, Schacht had moved on to bigger things. It was perhaps not surprising that he had such little success in electoral politics. He was simply a hard man to like. People found him cold and unemotional, overly calculating and shrewd. By his own admission, he came across as hard, callous, and buttoned down. It was partly his appearance. One acquaintance remarked, "He managed to look like a compound of a Prussian reserve officer and a budding Prussian judge who was trying to copy the officer." His physically distinctive characteristics, the crew cut, the rigid bearing, the stiffly upright posture, the perpetual aggressive scowl, would, after he had become famous, make him a popular target for cartoonists. But more than his appearance, it was his character traits. His extreme vanity, his tendency to talk about himself and his achievements, his inflexibility, his caustic wit laced with cynicism, that put people off. He displayed an astounding self-confidence. This was not a facade, but a reflection of his astonishing sense of innate superiority. He was in many ways a classic lower-middle-class overachiever. Having grown up poor, in a society where class and family background were still overwhelming factors, he had learned the hard way that in a hostile world he could rely only on himself. Whatever success he had achieved, he owed to himself alone, his own formidable intelligence and impressive capacity for hard work. Nothing seems sacred to him except his belief in himself, and this is so overwhelming as no longer to seem personal. He makes the most exaggeratedly egotistical statements without his hearer being aware of any personal boasting, wrote one observer. And unlike some men on the make, who cloak their cynicism behind a veneer of charm, he displayed no particular desire to be liked. Much later, when his true colors had been revealed, one politician would write, "He was a man apart, unique, solitary, without followers or any coterie of partisans. He had no friends, only enemies." But no one could dispute his self-discipline, energy, and unrelenting drive. The problem of German reparations, that is, how much of the cost of the war the victors, particularly Britain and France, could demand from Germany, was to haunt the financial landscape of Europe for the next 20 years. The war may have ended, but the conflicts did not stop. At the Paris Peace Conference, which opened in January 1919, no other issue caused more trouble, contention, hard feeling, and delay, recalled Thomas Lamont, one of the American negotiators. Everyone arrived in Paris expecting France, which had suffered the worst civilian damage and heaviest casualties, to be the strongest advocate of punitive reparations against Germany. Instead, it turned out to be Britain. A strong liberal contingent within the British Treasury had developed peace plans based on a moderate settlement. But in the months leading up to the peace conference, the press, led by the Times and the Daily Mail, launched a cheap jingoistic campaign in favor of a harsh settlement, and, during the December 1918 election campaign, the slogan that the Allies should squeeze Germany until the pipsqueak struck a chord with the electorate. The British Prime Minister, David Lloyd George, pandering to public opinion, appointed to the British delegation to the Reparations Commission in Paris 3 of the most hardline advocates of a punitive settlement: William Hughes, the doggedly aggressive Prime Minister of Australia; Lord Sumner, a law lord with a reputation for being stony-hearted; and Lord Cunliffe, the boorish and irascible former governor of the Bank of England. Cunliffe was supposed to be the financial brains of this trio. Although he had been a successful banker and even governor of the Bank of England, he retained his ignorance of the most basic rudiments of economics. In the weeks before departing for Paris, he recommended that Germany be required to pay $100 billion in reparations. It was an astounding figure. Germany's annual GDP before the war had been around $12 billion. To burden it with a debt 8 times its annual income would have been the height of madness. The interest on that debt alone would have consumed 40% of its GDP. Though Cunliffe was willing to admit that the basis for the calculation was little more than a shot in the dark, which he had been pressed to arrive at between a Saturday and a Monday, he speculated that perhaps he had even underestimated Germany's capacity to pay, and that if anyone argued that Germany could pay $200 billion, he would not disbelieve him. France's desire for reparations arose from its own sense of vulnerability. Twice invaded by Germany in the last 50 years, France was consumed by the fear of a German revival. Germany was more aggressive, more successful, younger, richer, and more dynamic. It was also 50% larger, 60 million Germans versus 40 million Frenchmen, though the French Prime Minister, Georges Clemenceau, never actually made the statement attributed to him by German propaganda that the fundamental problem was that there were 20 million too many Germans. It was clearly in his mind. France was therefore determined to weaken Germany by every means possible, by disarmament, by slicing off as many parts of its neighbor as it could, and by extracting reparations. During the negotiations in Paris, it became apparent that to the French, money was subsidiary to security. While the French finance minister, Liaquat, kept pushing for high reparations, Clemenceau, the head of the French delegation, treated him with contempt, calling him the only Jew who knows nothing about money and marginalizing him along with all the other French cabinet members in the negotiations. Clemenceau tried to be flexible on reparations as a bargaining chip with the Americans in return for security guarantees along their border with Germany. Only when the guarantees proved to be inadequate did he revert to demanding high reparations. It fell to the American delegation, which included the famous stock market speculator Bernard Baruch, Thomas Lamont of J.P. Morgan and Company, and a young aide, the 31-year-old John Foster Dulles, to act as the advocates for moderation. They adopted the position that a large reparations bill was incompatible with the initial terms of the armistice agreement under which Germany had laid down its arms. Moreover, they argued that punitive reparations would act as a millstone, not simply around Germany's neck, but around that of all Europe. The negotiations over reparations dragged on for 10 weeks. By the end of March, they were still at an impasse. The British delegation on the Reparations Commission, led by Lord Cunliffe and Lord Sumner, who were by then nicknamed the Heavenly Twins because they were always together and insisted on such outrageously high figures, would not agree to a settlement of less than $55 billion. The Americans preferred a settlement in the region of $10 to $12 billion and would go no higher than $24 billion. Although President Wilson was, for the most part, out-negotiated and outfoxed by the other leaders in Paris, on this point the American delegation stuck to their guns and refused to agree to reparations that exceeded these limits. Several attempts were made to break the deadlock. Lloyd George himself applied his considerable political skills, but Cunliffe and Sumner refused to budge. Lloyd George's maxim was never to enter into costly frontal attacks, either in war or politics, if there was a way round, and he had originally appointed them in the hopes of bamboozling them into endorsing a moderate settlement. Now he found himself captive to their intransigence. His solution was to do an end run around them by proposing, at the last minute, that the peace conference defer the assessing of reparations to a later date, delegating it to a specially appointed body, which would be required to make its recommendation no later than May 31, 1921. He hoped that by that time, passions would have cooled, the political climate in Britain would have changed, and a more reasonable settlement could be arranged. In the first few months of 1919, as the peace conference was getting underway, Schacht, lulled like many other Germans by the high-minded pronouncements of Woodrow Wilson, still expected a generous peace. He believed that the real problem would be the overhang of debt after the war, which would lead to a general European bankruptcy. He talked naively of a grand plan for reconstruction. The great natural resources of Russia would be opened up for exploitation by a unique partnership between Great Britain and Germany, Britain providing the leadership and capital, Germany the manpower and engineering skills. In May 1919, when the terms of the peace treaty were finally unveiled to Germany, the whole country exploded in shock and anger. It was to lose 1/8 of its territory. Alsace and Lorraine were to revert to France. The Saar coal mines were also ceded to France. North Schleswig was to be subject to a plebiscite as to whether it wished to become part of Denmark. Upper Silesia, Posen, and West Prussia went to Poland. Both banks of the Rhine were to be permanently demilitarized. The army was to be cut to no more than 100,000 men, the navy was to be dismantled, and the merchant marine distributed to the Allies. Though the Allies had delayed fixing the size of reparations, it was widely known that the amounts being mooted were gigantic. In the interim, Germany was required to pay an initial $5 billion before May 1, 1921. A new reparations commission, to be based in Paris, was created specifically to determine Germany's liability and to supervise its collection. The worst humiliation was Article 231, the Article of Shame, which branded Germany as solely responsible for the war. The reaction within Germany to the peace treaty reached a pitch of hysteria. All forms of public entertainment were suspended for a week as a sign of protest. Flags across the country were lowered to half-mast. The Chancellor, Philip Scheidman, characterized the terms as unbearable, unrealizable, and unacceptable, and proclaimed that it would make the Germans slaves and helots, doing forced labor behind barbed wire and prison bars. The Germans were given a deadline of 5 days to agree to the terms or face a resumption of hostilities. Scheidman resigned rather than put his signature on the document, of which he said, "What hand would not wither which placed this chain upon itself and upon us?" On the day that Germany accepted the terms, its Protestant churches declared a day of national mourning. Behind all the divisions that were to rack Germany for the next few years, the one single factor that united every class and every political party, Democrats and Royalists, liberals and socialists, Catholics and Protestants, Northerners and Southerners, Prussians, Bavarians, Saxons, and Hessians, was the injustice of the peace treaty, or as it was called, the Diktat. And of all the various penalties heaped on Germany by the treaty, disarmament, dismemberment, occupation, and reparations, it was reparations that would become the single most consuming obsession of German foreign policy. Germany had meekly agreed to reduce its military machine to a shadow of its former power, thus leaving it impotent to do anything about the loss of territory or of its colonies. Only on reparations did Germany seem able to fight back. It discovered what every large debtor at some point discovers, that when one owes a large amount of money, threatening to default can give one the upper hand. Schacht's first introduction to the issue of reparations came in the fall of 1919. He was asked to join a group of industrialists and businessmen sent to The Hague to negotiate with the Allied Commission on the delivery of goods in kind as part of the interim settlement. The German delegation was subjected to a litany of petty humiliations. They were forced to stay at the worst hotel, given bad food, their movements restricted, and they were openly followed. Finally, during the negotiations themselves, they were not even provided with chairs, but were required to stand. When Schacht complained, he was told, "You seem to forget that your country lost the war." It was Schacht's first encounter with what he was to call the medieval arrogance of the victors. Ironically, it was not a German but an Englishman who launched the most devastating attack on reparations. In November 1919, John Maynard Keynes, the young Cambridge Don, published The Economic Consequences of the Peace. In the book, Keynes argued that in order for Germany to earn the money to pay the Allies, it would have to sell more goods than it bought, and its trade partners would have to be willing to absorb this large influx of goods, with potentially crippling consequences for their own industries. It was therefore in the Allies' own self-interest to moderate their demands. As he put it, if Germany is to be milked, she must not first of all be ruined. He concluded that the most Germany could afford to pay, without causing a massive disruption of world trade, was around $6 billion. The book became an immediate bestseller. Over 100,000 copies were bought worldwide in its first 6 months alone. It was serialized in the United States, in the New Republic, and in France by La Nouvelle Revue Française and translated into French, German, Dutch, Flemish, Danish, Swedish, Italian, Spanish, Romanian, Russian, Japanese, and Chinese. At the age of 36, Keynes's brilliant pen had carried him to fame, not merely in Britain but across the world. From an early age, people had remarked on young Maynard's intellect, which had been carefully nurtured from his childhood. Born in 1883, in Cambridge, England, he spent most of his life in and around Cambridge University. His father, John Neville Keynes, was a Don, a philosopher and logician of great early promise but little ambition who had drifted into university administration. Maynard spent 4 years at Eton, where he was one of those golden boys known both for their extraordinary academic achievement and their social popularity, and in 1902 he entered King's College, Cambridge, to read mathematics. He was soon elected to that elite intellectual society nicknamed the Apostles, which already included G. E. Moore, Bertrand Russell, and Lytton Strachey. He spent his years at Cambridge absorbed in a hothouse combination of high-minded philosophical debate and homoerotic entanglements with his fellow apostles. Even Bertrand Russell, rarely impressed by other people's brainpower, wrote that Keynes' intellect was the sharpest and clearest that I have ever known. After graduating in 1904, Keynes briefly tried to escape the university by joining the India office as a clerk. He had only come second in the civil service exams and missed being selected for the Treasury, though he would characteristically insist that it was because I evidently knew more about economics than my examiners. Within a year of going to the India office, he resigned. Even though the hours were not at all taxing, he worked from 11 a.m. to 5 p.m. on weekdays, 11 a.m. to 1 p.m. on Saturdays, and had 8 weeks vacation a year plus Derby Day. He had found that he did not have enough to do. His assignments included organizing the shipment of 10 Ayrshire bulls to Bombay and preparing an annual report to Parliament, the moral and material progress of India. Amused by the Victorian pomposity of the whole exercise, he joked to Lytton Strachey that he planned to include an illustrated appendix on sodomy. Bored with the work and finding it difficult to restrain his natural irreverence toward authority, he returned to Cambridge. While he almost immediately gained a lectureship in economics at the university, his first love had always been philosophy. In 1909, he began work on a book on the philosophical foundations of probability, which he hoped would change the way philosophers thought about uncertainty. The themes of the book, that nothing can be known with certainty, that it is hard to define what is a rational course of action when the future is so indeterminate, that intuition rather than analysis provides the ultimate basis for action in these circumstances, were to color much of his later economic thinking and his almost equally remarkable ability to make money from speculating. But for all his passion for abstract ideas and philosophical discussions, Keynes also had wider and worldlier ambitions. In addition to his teaching duties and the book on probability, he spent the years before the war as a member of the Royal Commission on Indian Currency and Finance, even publishing a book on the subject. He took over the investment portfolio of his college, wrote occasional pieces on financial matters for the Morning Post and The Economist, and became the editor of the Economic Journal, to which he also contributed articles and reviews. Then there were his hobbies, the magnificent collections of old books and modern paintings, his golf, his passion for the ballet, and his many remarkable and varied friends. Indeed, there were times when he almost seemed to have too many interests. To accommodate all these activities, he would spend a couple of days every week in London, where he shared a house at 38 Brunswick Square with some of his Bloomsbury friends, among them Adrian Stephen and Adrian's sister Virginia and her husband Leonard Wolfe, many of whom he had met as an undergraduate at Cambridge. But while his bohemian comrades viewed the world of money and power as somehow tainted, he very much wanted to be part of it. His chance to return to government came with the war. On Sunday, August 2nd, he was in Cambridge when he received a letter from an old colleague at the UK Treasury, Basil Blackett. I tried to get hold of you yesterday, but found that you were not in town. I wanted to pick your brains for your country's benefit and thought you might enjoy the process. If by chance you could spare time to see me on Monday, I should be grateful, but I fear the decisions will all have been taken by then. Such an invitation from a man he respected, offering access to the center of world affairs, was irresistible. Unwilling to wait for the next train up to London, he persuaded his brother-in-law, A.V. Hill, to take him up to London in the sidecar of his motorcycle. By the end of the day, Keynes was ensconced in the Treasury building in Whitehall, busy drafting a note for the Chancellor on whether Britain should follow the rest of Europe into abandoning the gold standard. Within a few months, he had a job as a junior economic advisor within the Treasury. He quickly rose within its rank. In early 1917, he became chief of the external finance division responsible for securing enough dollars on reasonable terms to pay for the war effort and keep the UK economy afloat. It was perhaps the most critical economic issue confronting Britain during the war, and put Keynes at the heart of economic policy making. He became completely absorbed in the heady atmosphere of life as an establishment mandarin, thrown into the highest social and political circles. He was invited for country weekends by the Prime Minister and his wife, played bridge at No. 10 Downing Street, spent the weekend at the home of the Chancellor of the Exchequer, dined with the Duke of Connaught and the Princess of Monaco. He was, in the words of the society hostess Adeline Morel, greedy for work, fame, influence, domination, admiration. That combination of success and cleverness could at times make him insufferable. His Bloomsbury friends, who inhabited a rarefied world of art and literature and ideas, were able to tease him about his newfound connections in high places. They were even willing to tolerate his irritating cocksureness. He was redeemed in their eyes by the subversive pleasure he took in challenging authority. No one was immune from his witty and biting riposts. Within just a few months of joining the Treasury, he told no less than Lloyd George, the Chancellor of the Exchequer, during a meeting, with the utmost respect, "I must, if asked my opinion, tell you that I regard your account as rubbish." But to the many other people to whom he was rude or insulting, he was simply an arrogant young man with an overblown sense of his own intellectual superiority. One would not have guessed at all of this by looking at him. He looked so very ordinary: receding chin, thinning hair, feeble military mustache, and he dressed so conventionally: dark three-piece suits and a Homburg, or sometimes a bowler. At first glance, he might have been a modestly successful city drone, an insurance broker maybe, or possibly a minor civil servant. Beneath that superior facade, he actually harbored some profound insecurities, especially about his looks. "I have always suffered, and I suppose always will, from a most unalterable obsession that I am so physically repulsive that I've no business to hurl my body on anyone else's," he once confessed to his friend Lytton Strachey. But most of those who were close to him agreed that he could be the most attractive and charming of companions, his conversation sparkling, brilliant, and witty. He was gay and whimsical and civilized, with that gift of amusing and surprising, with which very clever people, and only very clever people, can by conversation give a peculiar relish to life, remembered the art critic Clive Bell. Most of Keynes's Bloomsbury crowd were conscientious objectors. As the war dragged on, he himself became increasingly disillusioned with its terrible waste, the relentless loss of lives, the refusal of the politicians to contemplate a negotiated settlement, and the steady erosion of Britain's financial standing. In 1917, he wrote to his mother that the continuation of the war probably means the disappearance of the social order we have known hitherto. "With some regrets, I think I am not on the whole sorry. The abolition of the rich will be rather a comfort and serve them right anyhow. What frightens me is the prospect of general impoverishment. I reflect with a good deal of satisfaction that because our rulers are as incompetent as they are mad and wicked, one particular era of a particular kind of civilization is very nearly over." When the war ended, Keynes was appointed the principal Treasury representative at the Paris Peace Conference. Though his official titles included Deputy to the Chancellor of the Exchequer on the Supreme Economic Council, Chairman of the Inter-Allied Financial Delegates in the Armistice negotiations, and representative of the British Empire on the Financial Committee, he soon found himself completely excluded from the most important economic negotiations at Paris, those on reparations. He had to watch impotently from the sidelines as the nightmare of the peace conference was played out. As he later wrote, a sense of impending catastrophe overhung the frivolous scene. When the terms of the treaty were finally announced in the middle of May, exhausted and disgusted, he felt he had no alternative but to resign. He wrote to Lloyd George, "The battle is lost. I leave the twins, Sumner and Cunliffe, to gloat over." The devastation of Europe. The Economic Consequences of the Peace was a strange book to have sold so well. Two-thirds of it comprised a detailed, often technical, polemic against reparations. At the time and even after, the whole debate over reparations was obfuscated by the enormous figures involved. They were simply too large and abstract for most people, including politicians and many bankers, to comprehend, particularly in an era when few people knew what the GDP of Germany or Britain was, or even what the term meant. Keynes was able to pierce through all of this confusion and translate the tens of billions of dollars that were being bandied about so readily into something more tangible for the average man to grasp. A book replete with figures and tables on the value of the housing stock of France and Belgium, the composition of German exports and imports in 1914, and estimates of the size of the German railway rolling stock may have been unlikely material for a bestseller. But the sheer physicality of the technical details served as a chilling reminder that behind all of the abstract figures, this was an argument about the concrete things necessary to sustain standards of living. Its success was partly due to the artfully mordant portraits he drew of the Big Three at Paris. Clemenceau, dry in soul and empty of hope, very old and tired; Wilson, his thought and his temperament, essentially theological, not intellectual, his mind, slow and unadaptable; and Lloyd George, with 6 or 7 senses not available to ordinary men, judging character, motive, and subconscious impulse, perceiving what each was thinking and even what each was going to say next. Keynes was persuaded by several people, including his mother, to omit some of the best but most inflammatory descriptions, especially the portrait of Lloyd George, rooted in nothing. He is void and without content. One catches in his company the flavor of final purposelessness, inner irresponsibility, existence outside or away from our Saxon good and evil, mixed with cunning, remorselessness, love of power. What seemed to have captured the public imagination was the outline of the world economy that Keynes was able to draw. In bold, broad strokes, he described the workings of the pre-war Edwardian world, the fragile foundations on which it had been built, and the mutilation to its financial fabric left by the war. He gave a foreboding picture of the future as the forces that had sustained the old economic order began to come asunder. Sounding at times like an Old Testament Jeremiad, the book spoke of civilization under threat, of men driven by starvation to the nervous instability of hysteria and mad despair. The tone of impending doom may seem overwrought to our ears, but to a generation that had just emerged from the most horrendous and apparently pointless apocalypse, it rang true. The economic consequences had an enormous impact on thinking about reparations throughout the world. The biggest change occurred in Britain. Even before the peace conference had adjourned in June 1919, Lloyd George had already begun to have second thoughts about the treaty. At the 11th hour, he even tried to convince the other 2 leaders that perhaps they should soften the terms, but Wilson had adamantly refused, saying that the Prime Minister ought to have been rational to begin with, and then would not have needed to have funked at the end. It was not simply Lloyd George's guilty conscience that led to the British change of heart. Britain, that nation of shopkeepers keen to get back to business, rediscovered the economic centrality of Germany. As Foreign Minister, Lord Curzon announced to the cabinet, "Germany is to us the most important country in Europe." France, however, clung resolutely to its implacable hostility to its ancient enemy, and with the United States out of the European picture, and Britain increasingly sympathetic to Germany, it found itself isolated. In the 4 years after the peace conference, from early 1919 until the end of 1922, Europe was treated to the spectacle of one international gathering after another devoted to reparations. With governments in both France and Germany constantly falling, during those 4 years France went through 5 and Germany 6. The one constant fixture at all these gatherings was the British Prime Minister, Lloyd George. As if trying to make up for his failure in Paris, he threw himself into the process. By one calculation, he attended 33 different international conferences in those few years. So many of them were held in the gambling resorts and spas of Europe, at San Remo in April 1920, in Boulogne in June, at Wiesbaden in October 1921, at Cannes in January 1922, and the final circus at Genoa in April 1922, that the French Prime Minister, Raymond Poincaré, dismissed them as la politique de casinos. For all the magnificent and luxurious settings, these gatherings were painful affairs, not least because the French were so unclear in their own minds what they wanted. As Poincaré said in June 1922, "As far as I am concerned, it would pain me if Germany were to pay. Then we should have to evacuate the Rhineland. Which do you regard as better, obtaining cash, or acquiring new territory. I for my part prefer occupation and conquest to the money of reparations. Or as Lloyd George more pithily put it, France could not decide whether it wanted to make beef stew or milk the German cow. All the age-old animosities between the British and the French, buried for a decade under the common purpose of confronting Germany, resurfaced. The old stereotypes of the French, those vainglorious, quarrelsome, restless, and oversensitive people, on which previous generations of Englishmen had been reared, were revived. Foreign Minister Curzon complained of the French proclivity for the gratification of private, generally monetary, and often sordid interests or ambitions, only too frequently pursued with a disregard of ordinary rules of straightforward and loyal dealing which is repugnant and offensive to normal British instincts. At one point, in 1922, he became so frustrated in a confrontation with French Prime Minister Poincaré that he collapsed in tears, crying, "I can't bear him." Dealing with Germany was no easier. Before the war, an American journalist had remarked on that uneasy vanity, that touchiness that has made Germany the despair of all the diplomats all over the world. The initial outrage over the Versailles Diktat had now curdled into frustration, bitterness, and resentment, which only made the defeated nation more difficult to deal with. From that first moment in May 1919, when the German foreign minister, Count Ulrich Graf von Brockdorff-Rantzau, had insulted the Allied statesmen at Versailles by refusing to stand while addressing them, the Germans caused offense by their arrogant demeanor. It was not simply their bad manners. They calculated, very correctly, that the longer they could string out the bargaining over reparations, the less they would end up paying. Their whole strategy was therefore to negotiate in bad faith. In the first 2 years after signing the treaty, Germany desperately scraped together what it could, and paid $2 billion out of the $5 billion of interim payments due. Meanwhile, the Reparations Commission, established in Paris in mid-1920, finally put a figure of $33 billion on the table as its estimate of the amount Germany should pay. The Germans responded by subjecting this figure to a series of adjustments to take into account what they had already paid, so transparently bogus as to embarrass even its own representatives in Paris, and concluded this meant they now owed the Allies just $7.5 billion, provoking Lloyd George to say that if the discussions continued any further in this vein, Germany would soon be claiming reparations from the Allies. In May 1921, British Treasury officials developed a proposal that they believed to be so reasonable that Germany would find it difficult to turn down. The reparations bill was to be set at the equivalent of $12.5 billion, roughly 100% of the German pre-war GDP. To meet the annual interest and principal repayments on this new debt, Germany was required to pay between $600 million and $800 million, a little over 5% of its annual GDP. In May 1921, the British proposal was accepted at a conference in London. It seemed as if agreement had finally been reached. The German delegation, led by Foreign Minister Walter Rathenau, made much of the new departure in policy. Henceforth, Germany would abandon its resistance to the terms of the treaty and instead would adopt a policy of fulfillment. The problem was that the Germans never really believed that they could meet even this commitment. Despite the fact that the new reparations bill was now closer to the amounts originally proposed by liberal commentators such as Keynes, German officials remained convinced that even $12.5 billion of reparations would prove an intolerable burden. As a consequence, they made no real effort to meet the terms of the London schedule. They paid on schedule just once. Within 6 months of the London settlement, they were in arrears and back before the Reparations Commission, pleading for a moratorium. Of the $1.20 billion that Germany owed during the first 18 months of the schedule, it paid little more than half. While Germany was grimly trying to negotiate relief from the burden of reparations, its domestic economic policy, bad as it had been during the war, became worse. The country was in perpetual turmoil, constantly on the brink of revolution, run by a series of weak coalition governments, and was quite unable to control its finances. In addition to large residual expenses from the war, pensions to veterans and war widows, compensation for those who had lost private property in the territories forfeited under the Treaty of Versailles. The governments took on enormous new social obligations: an 8-hour day for workers, insurance for the unemployed, health and welfare payments for the sick and the poor. Germany's financial problems were mostly self-inflicted. Nevertheless, reparation payments made what was already a difficult fiscal situation impossible. To finance the gap, the various governments of Germany resorted to the Reichsbank to print the money. In 1914, the mark stood at 4.2 to the dollar, meaning that a mark was worth a little under 24 cents. By the beginning of 1920, after the full effects of the inflationary war finance had worked through the system, there were 65 marks to the dollar. The mark was now worth only 1.5 cents, and the price level stood at 9 times its 1914 level. Over the next 18 months, despite an enormous budget deficit and a 50% increase in the amount of currency outstanding, inflation actually slowed down and the mark even stabilized. Foreign private speculators, betting that the mark had fallen too far, moved some $2 billion into the country. After all, this was Germany, not unjustly viewed before the war as the epitome of discipline, orderliness, and organization. It seemed inconceivable that it would allow itself to sink into an orgy of monetary self-abasement and give up on restoring order. Nothing like this has been known in the history of speculation, wrote Maynard Keynes. Bankers and servant girls have been equally involved. Everyone in Europe and America has bought mark notes. They have been hawked in the streets of the capitals and handled by barbers' assistants in the remotest townships of Spain and South America. A series of events, however, in the middle of 1921, French inflexibility over reparations, a campaign of political murder by right-wing death squads, broke the public's confidence that Germany's problems were soluble. It abandoned the mark in droves. The foreign speculators who had bought marks the previous 2 years also bailed out, losing most of the $2 billion they had pumped in. A visitor in the late 1920s to the game rooms of Milwaukee or Chicago would find the walls papered with German currency and bonds that had become worthless. As the mark plummeted, Germany became caught in an ever-deepening downward spiral. On June 24, 1922, the architect of fulfillment, Foreign Minister Walter Rathenau, one of the most attractive political figures in Germany, cultured, rich, scion of a great industrial family, was gunned down in his car by yet another group of crazed reactionaries. Panic set in. Prices rose 40-fold during 1922, and the mark correspondingly fell from 190 to 7,600 to the dollar. In early 1923, when Germany was late in meeting a reparations payment for that year, the precipitating incident was the failure to deliver 100,000 telephone poles to France. 40,000 French and Belgian troops invaded Germany and occupied the Ruhr Valley, its industrial heartland. The Chancellor, Wilhelm Kuno, powerless in every other way, launched a campaign of passive resistance. The budget deficit almost doubled to around $1.5 billion. To finance this shortfall required the printing of ever-increasing amounts of ever more worthless paper marks. In 1922, around 1 trillion marks of additional currency was issued. In the first 6 months of 1923, it was 17 trillion marks. Wrote one observer, "In the whole course of history, no dog has run after its own tail with the speed of the Reichsbank. The discredit the Germans throw on their own notes increases even faster than the volumes of notes in circulation. The effect is greater than the cause. The tail goes faster than the dog." The task of keeping Germany adequately supplied with currency notes became a major logistical operation involving 133 printing works with 1783 machines and more than 30 paper mills. By 1923, the inflation had acquired a momentum of its own, creating an ever-accelerating appetite for currency that the Reichsbank, even after conscripting private printers, could not meet. In a country already flooded with paper, there were even complaints of a shortage of money in municipalities, so towns and private companies began to print their own notes. Over the next few months, Germany experienced the single greatest destruction of monetary value in human history. By August 1923, A dollar was worth 620,000 marks, and by early November 1923, 630 billion. Basic necessities were now priced in the billions. A kilo of butter cost 250 billion. A kilo of bacon 180 billion. A simple ride on a Berlin streetcar, which had cost 1 mark before the war, was now set at 15 billion. Even though currency notes were available in denominations of up to 100 billion marks, it took whole sheaves to pay for anything. The country was awash with currency notes, carried around in bags, in wheelbarrows, in laundry baskets and hampers, even in baby carriages. It was not simply the extraordinary numbers involved. It was the dizzying speed at which prices were now soaring. In the last 3 weeks of October, they rose 10,000-fold, doubling every couple of days. In the time that it took to drink a cup of coffee in one of Berlin's many cafes, the price might have doubled. Money received at the beginning of the week lost 9/10 of its buying power by the end of the week. It became meaningless to talk about the price of anything, because the numbers changed so fast. Economic existence became a race. Workers, once paid weekly, were now paid daily with large stacks of notes. Every morning, big trucks loaded with laundry baskets full of notes rolled out of the Reichsbank printing offices and drove from factory to factory, where someone would clamber aboard to pitch great bundles to the sullen crowds of workers, who would then be given half an hour off to rush out and buy something before the money became worthless. They grabbed almost anything in the shop to barter later on for necessities in the flea markets, which had sprung up around the city. Having to calculate and recalculate prices in the billions and trillions made any sort of reasonable commercial calculations almost impossible. German physicians even diagnosed a strange malady that swept the country, which they named cipher stroke. Those afflicted were apparently normal in every respect except, according to the New York Times, for a desire to write endless rows of ciphers and engage in computations more involved than the most difficult problems in logarithms. Perfectly sensible people would say they were 10 billion years old or had 40 trillion children. Apparently cashiers, bookkeepers, and bankers were particularly prone to this bizarre disease. Most people simply turned to barter or to using foreign currency. Every middle-class housewife knew up to the latest hour the exchange rate for the mark against the dollar. At every street corner, in shops and tobacconists, even in apartment blocks, minute bureaus de change sprang up, with blackboards outside, advertising the latest exchange rates. With the mark falling faster than domestic prices were rising, foreigners were able to live grotesquely well. Berlin apartments worth $10,000 before the war could be bought for as little as $500. Malcolm Cowley, an American literary critic then living in Paris, in Berlin to visit his friend the journalist Matthew Josephson, wrote, "For a salary of $100 a month, Josephson lived in a duplex apartment with 2 maids, riding lessons for his wife, dinners only in the most expensive restaurants, tips to the orchestra, pictures collected, charities to struggling German writers." It was an insane life for foreigners in Berlin, and nobody could be happy there. For $100, a Texan hired the full Berlin Philharmonic for an evening. The contrast between the extravagance of foreigners, many of them French or British, but also Poles, Czechs, and Swiss, and the daily struggles of the average German to make a living only fed the resentment against the Versailles settlement further. Inflation transformed the class structure of Germany far more than any revolution might have done. The rich industrialists did well. Their large holdings of real assets, factories, land, stocks of goods, soared in value while inflation wiped away their debts. Workers, particularly the unionized, also did surprisingly well. Until 1922, their wages kept up with inflation and jobs were plentiful. It was only in the last stages, from the end of 1922 into 1923, when the implosion of confidence caused the monetary system to seize up and the economy reverted to barter, that men were thrown out of work. Those who made up the backbone of Germany, the civil servants, doctors, teachers, and professors, were hit the worst. Their investments in government bonds and bank deposits, carefully accumulated after a lifetime of prudence and discipline, were suddenly worthless. Forced to scrape by on meager pensions and salaries, which were decimated by inflation, they had to abandon their last vestiges of dignity. Imperial officers took jobs as bank clerks, middle-class families took in lodgers, professors begged on the streets, and young ladies from respectable families became prostitutes. The people who truly raked it in were the speculators. By buying up assets, houses, jewelry, paintings, furniture, at throwaway prices from middle-class families desperate for cash, by cornering the market in goods that were in scarce supply, profiteering in imported commodities and gambling on a further collapse in the currency, they enriched themselves beyond their wildest dreams. As German society was overturned, the traditional values that had made it so conservative and ordered a community were jettisoned. Stefan Zweig, the writer, tried to capture the mood of that time in his autobiography. How wild, anarchic, and unreal were those years in which, with the dwindling value of money, all other values in Austria and Germany began to slip. It was an epoch of high ecstasy and ugly scheming, a singular mixture of unrest and fanaticism. Every extravagant idea reaped a gold harvest. The official most responsible for the reckless policy of inflation was none other than Rudolf von Havenstein, the sober and dedicated president of the Reichsbank who had so disastrously overseen Germany's wartime finances. When the war ended in disaster, von Havenstein fully expected to lose his job. A Prussian official closely identified with the imperial administration, he did not conceal his lack of sympathy for the new government led by the Social Democrats. Nevertheless, during the Revolution of 1918, he went out of his way to cooperate with it, even allowing one of the new workers' and soldiers' councils to form within the Reichsbank. During those days of violence and turmoil, he also used a squad of revolutionary sailors to guard the Reichsbank's gold reserves to convey the message that it was the people who controlled the nation's treasure, though the word was that he had secretly booby-trapped the safes with poison gas just in case the sailors' loyalty wore thin. Having successfully maneuvered to keep his job, von Havenstein found himself in the classic dilemma of the dutiful civil servant. He was now working for a government for which he had little liking, one that was pursuing a social agenda he did not believe in and thought Germany could ill afford. Worst of all, the government had decided to make its best efforts to pay the Allies' demands, the so-called policy of fulfillment. Nevertheless, despite these fundamental disagreements, von Havenstein acceded to the government's requests and allowed the Reichsbank to print money to finance the budget gap. Why did von Havenstein submit without any apparent effort to resist? Two very conflicting pictures have been drawn of his motives. That he deliberately engineered the whole monetary explosion as a way of destroying the financial fabric of Germany, a collective self-immolation designed to prove to the Allies that reparations were uncollectible, or alternatively, that his conduct reflects nothing subtler than sheer economic ignorance. Trained as a lawyer, he had learned the banking business during the gold standard era, when the rules of monetary policy were dictated by the requirement that the Reichsmark be kept convertible at a fixed gold equivalent, and was completely at sea in a world not hitched to gold. The truth seems to be more complex than either explanation. Von Havenstein faced a very real dilemma. Were he to refuse to print the money necessary to finance the deficit, he risked causing a sharp rise in interest rates as the government scrambled to borrow from every source. The mass unemployment that would ensue, he believed, would bring on a domestic economic and political crisis, which in Germany's current fragile state might precipitate a real political convulsion. As the prominent Hamburg banker Max Warburg, a member of the Reichsbank's board of directors, put it, the dilemma was whether one wished to stop the inflation and trigger the revolution, or continue to print money. Loyal servant of the state that he was, von Havenstein had no wish to destroy the last vestiges of the old order. Alternatively, if by standing firm against the government he forced it to raise taxes or cut domestic expenditures, he would be accused, particularly by his nationalist friends on the right, of being a tool of the blood-sucking Allies, who all along had been insisting that Germany could pay reparations if it would only cut its domestic expenditures and raise taxes. In effect, von Havenstein would be in the position of doing the Allies' dirty work. He just could not bring himself to act as the collection agent for his country's enemies. Faced with these confusing and competing considerations, von Havenstein decided to play for time, supplying the government with whatever money it needed. Contrary to popular myth, He was perfectly aware that printing money to finance the deficit would bring on inflation, but he hoped that it would be modest, and that in the meantime, something would turn up to induce the Allies to lower their demands, or at least agree to a moratorium on actual payments, giving Germany some breathing space. It was a total miscalculation. Von Havenstein failed to recognize that experimenting with the currency was like walking a knife edge. A moderate degree of inflation does not remain moderate for long. At some point, the public loses confidence in the authorities' power to maintain the value of money and deserts the currency in panic. Germany passed this tipping point in the middle of 1921. Instead of admitting that he had made a terrible mistake, von Havenstein, with his dogged Prussian sense of duty, dug in his heels, refusing to change any of his policies and continuing to print as much money as the government needed. The inflation had initially been beneficial to private business because it had the effect of wiping out their debts. By 1923, however, the crisis had moved to a new stage, and without a functioning currency, commerce became impossible. Unemployment, which had hovered around 3%, suddenly shot up to 20% in the fall of 1923. In order to maintain some illusion of solvency, von Havenstein began to pump Reichsbank money directly to private businesses. He hid behind the claim that, but for reparations, there would be no inflation in Germany and therefore put the blame for the inflation on the rapacious demands of foreigners. He began arguing that the inflation had nothing to do with him, that he was a passive bystander to the whole process, that his task was simply to make enough money available to grease the wheels of commerce, and if business required 1 trillion more marks, then it was his job to make sure they were run off the presses and efficiently distributed around the country. On August 17, 1923, he delivered his annual report on economic conditions before the Council of State. The Reichsbank today issues 20,000 milliard marks of new money daily, of which 5,000 milliards are in large denominations. In the next week, the bank will have increased this to 46,000 milliards daily, of which 18,000 milliards will be in large denominations. The total issue at present amounts to 63,000 milliards. In a few days, we shall therefore be able to issue in one day 2/3 of the total circulation. Here was the president of the Reichsbank, whose principal obligation was supposed to be the preservation of the value of the currency, proudly proclaiming to a group of parliamentarians that he now had the capacity to expand the money supply by over 60% in a single day and flood the country with even more paper. For many people, it was just one more sign that German finance had entered an Alice in Wonderland phantasmagoria. No one could anticipate such an ingenious revelation of extreme folly to which ignorance and false theory could lead. The Reichsbank's own demented inspirations give stabilization no chance, wrote the British ambassador, Lord D'Abernon, an expert on state bankruptcies who had thought that he surely had to have witnessed the worst financial excesses in the lunacies of the Egyptian Khedives and the Ottoman Turks, only to find them almost Swiss in their rectitude compared to the Germany of 1923. It appears almost impossible to hope for the recovery of a country where such things are possible. It is certainly vain to hope for it unless power is taken entirely from the lunatics presently in charge. When the war ended, Hjalmar Schacht was just a modestly successful banker, not yet especially distinguished or rich. It was the opportunities thrown up by inflation that would make him powerful and wealthy. He certainly did not make money by speculating himself. Having grown up poor, he was very conservative and took few risks with his own savings. He was, however, lucky. In 1918, he recruited a 36-year-old stockbroker, Jacob Goldschmidt, to join the National Bank. Goldschmidt was talented, cultivated, and charming, very different from the traditional conservative bankers of Berlin, a self-made millionaire who had built a successful stock exchange trading firm. Once at the National Bank, Goldschmidt began playing the market with large amounts of the bank's capital, and by engineering a series of astute mergers, he transformed the bank, now named the Danube Bank, into the third largest banking conglomerate in Germany. By 1923, Schacht had suddenly been vaulted into the upper reaches of the Berlin banking establishment. In the summer of 1923, he stood at his office window contemplating the scene below. While most of the other large Berlin banks were housed along the Berlinstrasse in somber gray buildings with great rusticated stone walls and massive pillars and pilasters, the DEMENTED had chosen for its headquarters a charming red sandstone building overlooking a quiet square on the banks of the Spree. His own office commanded a perfect view of the square below, in the center of which stood a small bronze statue of Karl Friedrich Schinkel, architect who had designed so much of Berlin. A strangely tranquil scene, he reflected, far removed from the fever gripping the rest of the city. A constant reminder of what had happened to Germany loomed eastward across the canal. The Berliner Schloss, for almost 5 centuries the home of the Hohenzollern kings. The vast imperial palace of over 1,200 rooms, its grand dome dominating the landscape for miles, now stood empty, its contents looted and ransacked, its beautiful balconies splintered and shattered, its Baroque facade disfigured by large pallid patches where artillery shells had struck during the 1918 revolution. Schacht had become increasingly ambivalent about the new Republican Germany. In no way nostalgic about the past, he felt no regret at the passing of empire, with its old-style Prussian militarism that sought to impose a permanent order of society. But proud and nationalistic as he was, he did look back to the times before the war when Germany had been a nation of order and discipline, the economic powerhouse of Europe. The country was, in his view, now destroying itself pointlessly. The Republic had betrayed the professional middle classes, which had once made Germany so strong. The fatherland had become a hell's kitchen. Though he now had the money and position he had so long scrambled to acquire, Schacht felt frustrated. At the DEMENTED, he had been sidelined by the more successful Goldschmidt. By writing articles in the Berliner Tageblatt and the Vossische Zeitung, he had developed something of a reputation as an expert on reparations, arguing that Germany could and should pay no more than $200 million a year, equivalent to a total reparations settlement of $4 billion, a third of what had been agreed to in London in 1921. It was an amount that at the time would have been completely unacceptable to France. He tried to have it both ways. At the same time he was taking a hard line on the level of reparations that Germany could pay, he would urge the government to be more pragmatic, to open negotiations with the French, abandon the failed policy of passive resistance in the Ruhr, and cease printing money. Had he been honest with himself, he would have had to admit that he was lucky not to have been involved. Over the last 3 years, as the country had sunk into economic chaos, reparations had been a no-win issue for any German politician or official. The problem of collecting reparations from Germany was made infinitely more complex by that of war debts owed to the United States. Britain had gone to war as the world's banker, controlling over $20 billion in foreign investments. No other financial center, neither Berlin nor Paris, certainly not New York, came close to matching London's standing as the hub of international finance. Through it passed 2/3 of the trade credit that kept goods flowing around the globe and half the world's long-term investments, over $500 million a year. Meanwhile, France, though never so dominant a financial power, had its own overseas portfolio of $9 billion, of which an astounding $5 billion was invested in Russia. To pay for the 4 long, destructive years just past, every country in Europe had tried to borrow as much as it could from wherever it could. The effect was to create a seismic shift in the flow of capital around the world. Both Britain and France were forced to liquidate a huge proportion of their holdings abroad to pay for essential imports of raw materials, and both eventually resorted to large-scale borrowing from the United States. By the end of the war, the European Allied powers, 16 countries in all, owed the United States about $12 billion, of which a little under $5 billion was due from Britain and $4 billion from France. In its own turn, Britain was owed some $11 billion by 17 countries, $3 billion of it by France and $2.50 billion by Russia, a debt essentially uncollectible after the Bolshevik Revolution. At an early stage of the Paris Peace Conference, both the British and the French tried to link reparations to their war debts, indicating that they might be prepared to moderate their demands for reparations if the United States would forgive some of what they owed America. The United States reacted strongly, insisting that the two issues were separate. Its delegates, many of them lawyers, including the Secretary of State, Robert Lansing, made a clear moral and legal distinction between reparations, which resembled a fine and were intended to be punitive, and war debts, which were contractual liabilities voluntarily entered into by the European allies. The Europeans, less wedded to legal modes of thought, failed to see either the moral or the practical distinction between their obligations to the United States and Germany's obligations to them. Both would be burdensome and both would require material sacrifice for several generations. As the peace conference was winding to its end, Maynard Keynes, distressed at how the negotiations were going, decided on his own initiative to put together a comprehensive plan for the financial reconstruction of Europe. Reparations should be fixed at $5 billion, to be paid by Germany in the form of long-term bonds issued to the Allies, which they would in turn assign to pay their war debts to the U.S. government. All other obligations were to be forgiven. It was a clever scheme. The U.S. government would be functionally lending Germany money, which in turn would go to pay reparations to the Allies, who in turn would use those proceeds to settle their loans. The money would start in the United States flush with gold, and eventually return there full circle. Keynes passed the plan on to the Chancellor of the Exchequer, Austen Chamberlain, who in turn recommended it to Lloyd George. The Prime Minister received Keynes's plan just as he was beginning to realize the extent of his tactical errors over reparations and, in a short burst of enthusiasm, submitted it to President Wilson. It was rejected out of hand by the American delegates, who continued to insist that war debts must not be linked to reparations and that the former could not be forgiven on such a scale. And thus the problem of reparations and war debts would be allowed to fester over the maimed economic body of Europe. 10 days after the armistice of November 11, 1918, Benjamin Strong wrote to Montague Norman, "The principal danger now ahead of us is not social and political unrest, but that the coming peace negotiations would develop along lines of economic strife that would lead to a period of economic barbarism which will menace our prosperity. There is no doubt," he continued, "that much of the world's happiness in the future will depend upon the relations now being established between your country and ours. Over the next decade, that compact between Britain and the United States, or rather between the Bank of England and the Federal Reserve, built upon the friendship between Norman and Strong, would be one of the fixed points of the world's financial architecture." The two of them came to that compact from very different directions. For Norman, it was a matter of simple necessity. The war had devastated Britain economically, and, he believed, only by acting in conjunction with the Americans could Britain hope to regain its old financial influence. For Strong, the calculation was a little more complicated. As a banker from the Morgan fold, he was naturally an internationalist. The war had brought a new recognition among U.S. financiers that the fate of their country was inextricably linked to that of Europe. Now, with the arrival of peace, he believed that it was in its own interest for the United States to use some of its huge resources to help to rebuild a devastated Europe. There was also a moral imperative to Strong's internationalism. He was part of that generation of Americans who, having begun their careers under Theodore Roosevelt and having reached maturity under Woodrow Wilson, viewed themselves and their country as now uniquely qualified and positioned, by virtue of money and ideas, to transform the conduct of international affairs. He was, of course, not so naive that he did not recognize that many Europeans remained cynical about U.S. motives, accusing it, for example, of having deliberately waited until Europe had come close to bankruptcy before entering the war. He, however, was one of those who believed that now that the war was over, his nation had a unique opportunity to show that it was truly, in his own words, an unusually unselfish, generous people. He was especially influenced in his sense of high purpose about America's world mission by a group of young men with whom he had become friends who went by the mysterious name, the Family. Based in Washington, the Family was an exclusive private club, which he had been invited to join before the war. It had no official name, was indeed not really a club at all. No officers, no charter, no formal membership roll. It had come into being in 1902 when three young Army officers, Captains Frank McCoy, Sherwood Cheney, and James Logan, all in their early 30s, attracted to Washington by Theodore Roosevelt's call to youth, decided to rent a house together at 1718 H Street. This soon became a gathering spot for ambitious young diplomats and service officers, all similarly inspired by Roosevelt's vision of a muscular U.S. foreign policy. In the absence of a formal name, it came to be known as the 1718 Club or the Family. The membership progressively widened to include a more eclectic circle, including journalists, such as Arthur Page, editor of the popular monthly The World's Work, politicians, like Congressman Andrew Peters, who would become mayor of Boston, and bankers, such as Strong. Over the years, though, the family had remained an extraordinarily tight-knit group who kept in close touch with one another, particularly during the war. When the fighting finally stopped, many members found themselves thrown into the peace negotiations. No one was more emblematic of the ethos of the family than Willard Straight, a flamboyant charmer whose life reads like something out of a boy's adventure novel. Early orphaned, Straight had graduated from Cornell, gone out to China, where he learned Mandarin, served as a reporter during the Russo-Japanese War of 1904, become secretary to the American legation in Korea, been appointed consul general in Manchuria, and joined a Morgan-led bank in China, all by the age of 30. Thereafter he had married an heiress, Dorothy Whitney, helped found the New Republic, seen army service in France, and with the armistice, joined the advance team in Paris to prepare for the forthcoming peace conference. Tragically, he contracted influenza during the 1918 pandemic and died suddenly in December 1918, at the age of 38. Another member, Joseph Grew, had been in Germany as the number 2 in the embassy during the first years of the war, had gone on to become the State Department's desk officer for Germany, and was now leading the advance team in Paris. William Phillips, who came from a rich family and had rejected a pallid career in business to become a career Foreign Service officer, became a Far Eastern specialist after assignment to Peking. Subsequently posted to London, he was now an Assistant Secretary of State. Another Foreign Service hand, Basil Miles, a particularly close friend of Strong's, had taken his degree at Oxford, been posted to Petrograd in 1914, and was now state's prime expert on Russia. James Logan, one of the founders of this dedicated brotherhood, had stayed in the army, rising to the rank of lieutenant colonel, and had been posted to France in 1914 as chief of the American Observer military mission. An overweight bon vivant, he had become a fixture in Paris. Once the United States joined the war, he was given a high staff position in the American Expeditionary Force and was now working for Herbert Hoover in the Relief Administration. With so many fellow members of the family in Paris in the war's immediate aftermath, Strong decided that he should see for himself what needed to be done in Europe. But as happened so often over the next few years, his body gave out on him. Worn out by the demands of war finance, he suffered a minor recurrence of tuberculosis and was forced to take another leave of absence during the first few months of 1919. By the summer, he was back on his feet and ready to go to Europe. The peace conference had just finished, and as he left the United States, the country was still in the full flush of jubilation and optimism over the signing of the peace treaty. Strong arrived in England on July 21st, aboard RMS Baltic, as Britain's official peace celebrations were winding down. There had been parades and ceremonies across the country from the tiniest villages to the biggest cities. In London, 1 million people had come out to watch a huge parade, including American and French contingents led by General John Joseph, Black Jack, Pershing, and Marshal Ferdinand Foch, march past the King and Queen and members of the government. The capital was still decked out with flags, and the troops who had taken part were still camped out in Kensington Gardens as Strong's train rolled into the city. Although the statesman in Paris had failed to come up with some grand initiative to reconstruct Europe, he arrived full of great expectations, still convinced, for all the failures of the treaty, that the United States would eventually adopt a constructive policy towards the restoration of Europe by postponing the repayment of war debts and providing direct aid for reconstruction. For all the celebrations, he found the city's mood ominously changed. In contrast to America, Britain was only slowly readjusting to peace. Tobacco restrictions had been removed in January and most food rationing in May. But bread was still obtainable only with ration coupons, as was sugar. The initial optimism, which had gripped Britain and all the European victors immediately after the war, was now wearing off as the grim realities of Britain's underlying position were becoming steadily more apparent. The war had changed the balance of financial power, and Strong kept encountering a festering resentment against the United States, especially over war debts. Few people in those days thought in terms of a special relationship between Britain and the United States. Indeed, the phrase was only coined in 1945 by Winston Churchill. Before the war, most London bankers viewed their counterparts in the United States with that superciliousness reserved for unsophisticated kinsmen, too rich for their own good. Within the United States, certain circles, the House of Morgan, the partners at Brown Brothers, were natural Anglophiles. Elsewhere, Britain was generally regarded with suspicion and cynicism. But during the war and after, British arrogance had given way to resentment. London bankers worried that the United States, with its newly acquired financial muscle, was getting ready to elbow its way into the role of banker to the world. During Strong's visit to London in March 1916, he attended a speech made by Sir Edward Holden, chairman of the London City and Midland Bank, in which Sir Edward referred to efforts of American bankers to undermine Lombard Street's supremacy and was so overcome by the mere thought that the old man broke down and wept. Strong now found British bankers and politicians fervently convinced that the Allies have made the greatest and most vital sacrifice in the war, while the U.S. sacrifices had been slight, and our profits immense, and that existence of this great debt is a sword of Damocles hanging over their heads. There was considerable bitterness at how long the United States had sat out the war, many of Strong's English acquaintances believing that America had deliberately waited for Europe to wear itself out before stepping in to pick up the pieces. Now those same people argued that the U.S. government was morally obliged to forgive part of their European allies' war debts. This was especially true in Britain, which had borrowed some $5 billion from the United States, but had itself lent $11 billion to France, Russia, and other countries, in effect, simply acting as a conduit for the loans. And though his friend Norman tried to reassure him that people were allowing their hearts to rule their heads, that Britain's credit was still strong, and that it was still good for its debts, Strong was undoubtedly shaken by the pessimism that hung over the city of London. Not only had Britain's place in the world changed, but British society had also been transformed by the war. The aristocracy that had ruled Britain for much of the previous century had been badly damaged, as one contemporary author wrote, albeit with some exaggeration, in the useless slaughter of the guards on the Somme, or of the rifle brigade in Hooge Wood, half the great families, heirs of large estates and wealth, perished without a cry. After enduring savage losses in the fighting, the casualty rate had been 3 times heavier among junior officers, many of them aristocrats, than among enlisted men. The old elite had also been hurt by the wartime inflation and was now being decimated by post-war economic dislocations. Land prices had collapsed and many large estates been put up for auction. In place of the old and confident ruling class, a whole new breed, hard-faced men who had looked as if they had done well out of the war, as one eminent politician described his new colleagues in the House of Commons, had come to power. At the end of July, Strong went on to Paris and, for the next few weeks, used the Ritz Hotel on the Place Vendôme as his base while traveling around Europe. He visited Brussels, liberated only a few months before, Antwerp and Amsterdam, establishing connections with the heads of European central banks, but also taking a melancholy motoring trip through the giant cemeteries of the Western Front. The view from Paris was even more foreboding than from London. The city was dark by 10 p.m. for want of coal to generate electricity. The peace conference was still officially in session, limping through the final negotiations with the smaller Central Powers and successor states: Austria, Hungary, Bulgaria, and Turkey. But the big delegations had all departed, and with them the accompanying train of 10,000 other assorted people. The advisors, the wives, the mistresses, the cooks, drivers, messengers, secretaries, and journalists. The hotels had reverted to their normal business. At the end of July, the Majestic, headquarters of the British delegation during the conference, and the Krillin, that of the American delegation, both reopened for commercial business. The radical journalist Lincoln Steffens, who had come to Paris with the American delegation and stayed on after the conference, best captured the city's bitter mood of disillusionment during those months. The consequences of the peace were visible from Paris. There were wars, revolutions, distress everywhere. Over the summer, the political threats to Europe had actually begun to recede. Though civil wars still ravaged Russia, the risk of Bolshevik revolution in Germany had diminished. A communist uprising in Berlin and an attempted revolution in Bavaria had both been crushed. From Strong's point of view, the main danger was now economic. The two largest countries, France and Germany, both urgently needed food from abroad. Continental Europe was desperately short of capital to rebuild itself. Most disturbingly, he found a complete lack of leadership in Europe, with people in authority exhausted. While Strong was in Paris, it became apparent that the United States was beginning its retreat from European affairs. The peace treaty had run into trouble in the Senate and seemed headed for defeat. Though the president had announced his intention to appeal directly to the people, the mood of the country was clearly turning isolationist. Strong could not hide his disgust at this betrayal. At the end of August, he warned Russell Leffingwell, Under-Secretary of the Treasury and soon-to-be a Morgan partner, that if the United States were to desert Europe and leave these new governments to their fate, this could only result in prolonged disorder and suffering. It would be an act of cowardice for which we would be despised. He returned to the United States in late September. A few days before, on September 25th, the president had collapsed with a stroke on his Western campaign to drum up support for the treaty, and for the next year was to lie incapacitated in the White House. On November 19th, the Senate rejected the treaty by a vote of 55 to 39. As so often seemed to happen when he got back from Europe, Strong suffered yet another relapse of his tuberculosis. The doctors again insisted that he take a leave of absence, and the directors of the New York Fed released him for a year. Initially, he went out to Arizona for the elevation and dry climate, and by the following spring seemed well on the way to recovery. In March, he set off on horseback across the Arizona desert accompanied by an unusual troop of companions. A mule skinner come cook, a Pima Indian guide come horse wrangler whose name was either Frank, Francisco, Pancho, or Juan. No one was quite sure which, a Russian wolfhound named Peter, and Strong's old friend from the family, Basil Miles. As this entourage trekked across the wilderness, breathing the most wonderful air, seeing the most gorgeous sunsets, and sleeping under the stars, the problems of European reconstruction and currency chaos must have seemed far away. After Arizona, Strong decided to take advantage of his year off by traveling around the world. Accompanied by his eldest son, Ben, and his friend Miles, he left San Francisco in early April for Japan. They went on to China, the Philippines, Java, Sumatra, Ceylon, India, finally arriving at Marseilles in winter 1920. There Strong found a letter from Montague Norman awaiting him. Whenever you do come to London, let me remind you of your hotel, of which the address is Thorpe Lodge, Campden Hill, W.8. The booking clerk tells me that an hour's notice will be enough to get your room ready, or, if you are in a hurry, this can be done after you have arrived. While Strong had been traveling, Norman had been elevated to the governorship of the Bank of England. It was the beginning of a true partnership. If reparations poisoned the relations among European countries, war debts did the same to the relations between the United States and its erstwhile associates, Britain and France. However hard the Americans tried to separate war debts from reparations, in the minds of most Europeans they remained inextricably linked. Indeed, in the middle of 1922, the British government made the connection explicit in a note drafted by Arthur Balfour, then acting Foreign Secretary, that Britain would collect no more on its loans to its continental allies and on its share of reparations from Germany than the United States collected from it as payments on its own war debts. The Balfour Note provoked an outcry in the United States. Balfour, an aristocrat and philosopher of some repute, in 1895, he had published a work of great subtlety entitled The Foundations of Belief, was the elder statesman of British politics, having been Prime Minister before the war and Foreign Secretary under Lloyd George. Many were charmed by his urbane, gracious manners and his air of bemused detachment. At the peace conference, a British diplomat remarked that he makes the whole of Paris seem vulgar. In the United States, however, he was viewed as a top-hatted, frock-coated personification of British decadence, and the tone of condescension and moral superiority adopted in the note infuriated the Americans. Lord Balfour seems to think that he can call us sheep thieves in language so elegant that we shall not understand it, wrote one American. According to the Philadelphia Inquirer, in the Balfour note, John Bull is depicted as the liberal, magnanimous, and sympathetic creditor whose heart bleeds for his debtors' sufferings, and who is willing and anxious to relieve them of a burden which he perceives is beyond their ability to bear. Uncle Sam is portrayed as a ruthless, relentless, hard-hearted Shylock, who is making it impossible for John Bull to follow his altruistic and benevolent instincts by stubbornly insisting upon the letter of his bond. To make matters even worse, Congress had decided to get into the act. In March 1922, Congress created the five-man World War Foreign Debt Commission, which was chaired by the Secretary of the Treasury, Andrew Mellon, and included the Secretary of State, Charles Evans Hughes, the Secretary of Commerce, Herbert Hoover, Senator Reed Smoot of Utah, and Representative Theodore Burton of Ohio. The commission was to negotiate the terms on which American loans were to be repaid. Concerned that the administration might be too lenient on the debtors, Congress imposed a floor on any settlement. The commission would not be permitted to accept anything less than 90 cents on the dollar. The congressional stipulations on war debts provided the Europeans their turn to express outrage. Has America, which but yesterday we acclaimed for her generosity and her idealism, fallen to the role of a Shylock? Exclaimed a French senator in Leclerc. Throughout Europe, newspapers began referring to Uncle Sam openly as Uncle Shylock. Even The Economist, by no stretch a populist newspaper, printed a letter signed Portia that accused the United States of attempting to lay a tribute upon those who saved Kansas and Kentucky from the German peril. In October 1922, Lloyd George's government precipitously fell, and a new conservative government under Andrew Bonar Law took office in Britain. The incoming Chancellor of the Exchequer, Stanley Baldwin, was a practical and sensible businessman who believed strongly in settling one's debts. He was so firm an advocate of this principle that in 1919 he had anonymously donated $700,000 of his own money, a fifth of his net worth, to the government as his contribution to paying off the national debt after the war. With the rhetoric on both sides of the Atlantic becoming increasingly overheated, Baldwin decided to open negotiations for a settlement with the Americans, telling them he wanted to approach the discussion as businessmen seeking a business solution of what fundamentally is a business problem. A British delegation, led by Baldwin himself and including as its principal advisor, the Governor of the Bank of England, Montague Norman, set sail for the United States on December 30th aboard the Majestic. Norman was convinced that it was essential to settle with the Americans if Britain was to re-establish its credit and reclaim London's position as the world's premier financial center. He had visited the United States in August 1921 and May 1922 to make the rounds of senior administration officials in Washington with Strong, including a secret meeting with the President, Warren Harding, to convince them that the United States should remain engaged in European finance. As a result of this groundwork, of all the British financial officials, Norman had the best first-hand knowledge of U.S. politics and the situation in Washington. On the stormy Atlantic crossing, which took twice as long as normal because of rough seas, gale-force winds, and fog, Baldwin and Norman became fast friends. Norman was usually suspicious of politicians, claiming somewhat disingenuously to have no political views himself. He bragged that he had never voted. The stolid, uncharismatic Baldwin was the quintessential non-politician. They would remain lifelong friends, sharing a common taste for the pleasures of silence, of country walks and string quartets. Sir Percy Grigg, a high Treasury official who knew both well, described how they seemed to understand each other and to communicate without having to exchange more than a few monosyllables. The American negotiating team was led by Secretary Andrew Mellon. Then in his late 60s, Mellon had been born into a wealthy Pittsburgh family and by the age of 40 had independently amassed a fortune of some $500 million, making him the third richest man in America, after John D. Rockefeller and Henry Ford. Taciturn, cold, and reclusive, his son Paul would compare him to the money-obsessed Soames Forsythe of John Galsworthy's Forsyte Saga. Mellon's riches had brought him little happiness. In his 40s, he had married a frivolous young English girl of 19, who within a few years left him for a social climbing con artist, dragging him through a scandalous divorce in the process. He now lived in an opulently furnished six-bedroom apartment at 1785 Massachusetts Avenue, a block east of DuPont Circle, where his daughter Elsa, a self-involved and sickly young lady prone to all sorts of psychosomatic ailments, acted as hostess. The discussions were conducted in great secrecy, some sessions even taking place in Mellon's apartment, surrounded by old masters. There were lunches and dinners. To one such event, Vice President Calvin Coolidge, Silent Cal, was invited and did not utter a word to either of his neighbors during the entire meal. He would later famously dismiss the problem of war debts by exclaiming, "They hired the money, didn't they?" Despite prohibition, the British delegation was surprised to find an abundance of liquor in private homes. Before leaving London, they had been given to believe by the American ambassador that they should be able to reach an adjustment of 60 cents on the dollar, and the cabinet had not given them the authority to go any higher. Arriving in Washington, they discovered that while the U.S. administration was keen to settle, it was limited by what Congress would accept. After 2 weeks of negotiations, the best that the Americans could offer was 80 cents on the dollar. While Baldwin was frustrated by America's lack of generosity, at one point saying that he would like to ship them replicas of the golden calf, Norman pressed him to agree to the terms. In his view, the willingness of the Debt Commission to go beyond the limits set by Congress reflected a newly found desire on the part of Americans to come into Europe again, and even a stiff settlement was a small price to pay for getting the United States back into European affairs. On the way home, the British team passed through New York. Strong and the Morgan partners advised them that they would not get a better deal by waiting and urged them to settle. Arriving in Southampton on January 27, 1923, Baldwin made the foolish mistake of revealing the terms to the press even before he had had a chance to present them to the cabinet, and in the belief that his remarks were off the record, declared that he was for acceptance. He then dug himself in deeper by telling the gathered reporters that any deal would have to satisfy Congress, many of whose representatives came from the West, where they merely sell wheat and other products and take no further interest in the international debt or international trade. The headlines the next day announced that the British Chancellor of the Exchequer considered the average senator a hick from way back. The Prime Minister was furious. Having lost 2 of his sons in the war, Bonner-Law had been all along deeply offended by the American view of war debts as just another commercial transaction. "I should be the most cursed Prime Minister that ever held office in England if I accepted those terms," he told Baldwin. On January 30th, Baldwin made a strong plea in the cabinet for accepting the deal. He admitted that the Americans could have been more generous, that they had made great fortunes out of the war, that they worshipped the God Almighty dollar, but this was best that Britain was going to get. Bonner-Law spoke for rejecting the American offer. He had consulted Maynard Keynes, who counseled him to hold out, arguing that Britain should refuse the American offer in order to give them, the Americans, time to discover that they are just as completely at our mercy as we are at France's and France at Germany's. It is the debtor who has the last word in these cases. But Bonner-Law was cornered. To disavow his chancellor who had so publicly endorsed the deal would create a crisis in the government. Outvoted in the cabinet, he accepted defeat, but did take the opportunity to let off steam in the traditional British manner, by writing an anonymous letter to the correspondence columns of the Times in which he vigorously attacked his own government's decision to accede to the American terms. Watching Britain strike such a poor bargain for itself, France chose to wait it out. It would eventually settle its war debts in 1926, when it reluctantly conceded to pay 40 cents on the dollar. Even then, the arrangement was not ratified by the National Assembly until 1929. Italy did even better. When it settled, also in 1926, it would only agree to pay 24 cents on the dollar. As usual, Keynes had been right. Holding out would have given Britain a better deal. As the decade went on, and the Americans insisted on extracting these payments, they were shocked to discover how intensely disliked they were in Europe. Journalists sent home articles dissecting the various sources of American unpopularity under such titles as "Europe Scowls at Rich America" or "Does Europe Hate the U.S. and Why?" or even Uncle Shylock in Europe. One informal poll revealed that 60% of the French regarded the United States as their least favorite nation. The New York Times correspondent in Paris reported that 90 out of 100 regard Uncle Sam as selfish, as heartless, as grasping. Visiting Britain, the veteran American foreign correspondent Frank Simons discovered that the great majority of the British people have made up their minds that American policy is selfish, sordid, and contemptible. But the really pernicious effect of war debts was that they made it hard, if not impossible, for Britain to forego collecting its own debts from France and Germany, made France all the more obstinate in its efforts to collect reparations from Germany, and led Europe into a self-defeating vicious cycle of financial claims and counterclaims. In December 1922, as Norman set out for Washington, the Times of London profiled him. Mr. Montague Collett Norman, DSO, the Governor of the Bank of England, certainly one of the most interesting, as well as one of the most able men who have occupied the chair for a generation or more. In appearance, he recalls the early Victorian statesman. It went on, aristocratic in manner and temperament. His Shakespearean type of head sets well upon his tall, silent, and dignified figure. A lover of music, poetry, and books, Mr. Norman also possesses a collection of rare and beautiful woods. Many of those who come into contact with him feel that there is an indefinable touch of mystery about him. He has the keen sensitiveness of an intellectual. It was remarkable how enormous was the change that had come over Norman since August 1914. Then he had been a pathetic figure, unsure of himself and uncertain about his future, racked by neuroses, his less than illustrious career cut short by mental illness. Now he was generally recognized as the most prominent and powerful banker in all Europe, if not the world. From the very start of his tenure at the bank, Norman had made a point of breaking the mold. Whereas his predecessors had been driven to work, resplendent in top hat and frock coat, he turned up in a business suit by way of the underground, the central line from Notting Hill, with the ticket jauntily protruding from his hatband. His whole persona seemed to have been transformed. Almost everyone remarked on his graciousness, his courtly old-world manners, and most of all, the charm with which he was singularly gifted. As one of his fellow directors put it, he never made jokes or anything of that kind. He was just amusing, a continual bubble of wit. In those 5 years, he had also acquired something of a mystique in the public mind. Before Norman, the governor of the bank had generally been a figure of relative obscurity, known to only a few insiders within the square mile. But Norman's personality seemed to exert a powerful fascination on the press, which lauded him as a financial genius of great originality. All those traits, once viewed as the harmless eccentricities of a strange old man, his flamboyant way of dressing, his slouch hats, his artistic interests, his knowledge of Eastern philosophy, were now invested with great significance as signs of unusual creativity. His unorthodox appearance, his air of aloof, amused amiability, perhaps above all his apparent lack of interest in money, for all his place at the very center of its mysteries, all contributed to the image of austere power, half patrician, half priestly. This aura was reinforced by his policy of avoiding public appearances. He was rarely seen at the social events of the city, never made any speeches apart from the annual Mansion House toast required by tradition of the governor, and never submitted to newspaper interviews on the record. It was during those early years that Norman got into the habit of traveling under pseudonyms, which became so much a part of his myth and mystique. It was the high point in the era of the transatlantic liner. The Times of London and the New York Times regularly ran features listing the most notable passengers on the ocean liners scheduled to leave each week, generally extensions of the social pages heavily populated by ambassadors, film stars, and European nobility. News that the governor of the Bank of England was traveling to the United States inevitably gave rise to rumors. A settlement of war debts was imminent, or Britain might return to the gold standard that week. To avoid all this unfounded speculation, Norman's secretary, Edward Skinner, began booking Norman's passage under his own surname. At some point in Norman's travels across the Atlantic, plain old Skinner became Professor Clarence Skinner. The story goes, one among many, that during one such trip, a Professor Clarence Skinner, professor of applied Christianity at Tufts College in Medford, Massachusetts, and a well-known Universalist who had actively campaigned to repeal the statutes prohibiting blasphemy, happened to be traveling on the same liner. The reporters, hovering at the West Side piers of Manhattan for a dockside interview, mistook Norman, with his professorial demeanor, for Professor Clarence Skinner. Norman did nothing to disabuse them of their misconception, nor did the real professor, who, it seems, was quite amused. The whole incident so appealed to Norman's characteristically quirky sense of the absurd that, thereafter, he always traveled under the pseudonym Professor Clarence Skinner. Over time, his alias was unmasked by the press. Nevertheless, he continued the practice and talk of Professor Skinner, and his travels became something of an in-joke among the conoscenti. Norman's dislike of any sort of press coverage and his attempts to conceal his activities from reporters only further fed their curiosity. Even the most ordinary incidents of his daily life were magnified and nourished speculation. The results could be comic and at times absurd. Take a typical incident in March 1923, only days after France had occupied the Ruhr. Norman had left for his annual month's vacation in the south of France, where he generally stayed either with his half-uncle at Costabel, near Hyères, or at the Hermitage Hotel in Nice. On this occasion, he decided to stop off in Paris for a few days of meetings with his counterparts at the Banque de France. Making no attempt to keep his trip a secret, he stayed at the prominent and well-known Hotel Crillon, on the Place de la Concorde. Nevertheless, because the Crillon had mistakenly registered him under the name Norman Montague, the papers claimed that he was attempting to visit Paris incognito. When his valet was seen buying train tickets from a source other than the hotel's bureau, and was rumored to have been overheard asking the concierge about trains to Berlin, a wire report speculated that Norman was preparing to travel to Germany, and furthermore was attempting single-handedly to negotiate a settlement to the problem of reparations. The story ran in half the London press, and was picked up by many American papers, including the New York Times, the Washington Post, and the Chicago Tribune. In fact, after a few days in Paris, he left for Nice as usual. Winston Churchill, who would come to know Norman all too well for his liking over the next few years, would later portray him in the Sunday Pictorial. Mr. Norman's dislike of publicity in any form has enshrouded him with an air of mystery, which has led to ordinary and casual incidents of his daily life being scrutinized and magnified by the money markets of the world. The more he seeks privacy, the more significant his acts become. He travels under an assumed name and is instantly identified. He remains in seclusion in his country home, and the United States is searched to make sure that he is not there. Indeed, the very process of self-effacement has proved, to his added disgust, the most subtle and effective form of advertisement. It may well be that a little more plain speech would have served his real purpose better than so much silence and precaution. Not everyone was taken by his charm or his personality. Hating arguments or direct confrontations, he got his way by going around opponents and consequently developed a reputation for subterfuge. Some people retained a suspicion that Norman's attempts to cloak himself in mystery were simply a more subtle and sophisticated form of showmanship. Lord Vansittart, head of the British diplomatic service between the wars, dismissed him as a poseur. And while Norman's public persona may have changed dramatically, he still carried within him many of the same private demons that had beset him before the war. He was by nature a pessimist, prone to bouts of despair, unfortunate traits in a central banker confronted with the task of nursing a crippled economy back to health. During that first grim year in office, as he struggled with a weak pound and the depths of a recession, he wrote of his sensation of being as it were tossed about on a sea in which I can hardly swim. Francis Williams, then city editor of the left-wing Daily Herald, considered that though Norman was able to exert a strange fascination over the city, he was secretive, egotistic, suspicious of intellectual ability, and almost incapable of normal human relationships. Lord Cunliffe may have got the best measure of him when he confided that he thought Norman a brilliant neurotic personality who is certain to cause trouble. He added, "He's not an ordinary personality, He needs the power just to keep going, and he won't give it up until it's too late. During the early 1920s, Norman would often talk of creating a league of central bankers to take responsibility for stabilizing European finances and promoting world economic recovery. No government seemed capable of doing it, and he thought, a little grandiosely, that his guild could somehow fill the vacuum left by politicians. He liked to envisage himself and the other members of his small brotherhood as elite tribunes, standing above the fray of politics, national resentments, and amateur nostrums. Though Norman delighted in appearing unconventional, his views about society were very much those of an old Etonian. Still an Edwardian, he clung to the belief in aristocratic government. In March 1922, he wrote to Strong in that elliptical way of his, "Only lately have the countries of the world started to clear up after the war, 2 years having been wasted in building castles in the air and pulling them down again. Such is the way of democracies, it seems, though a few aristocrats in all countries realized from the start what must be the inevitable result of hastily conceived remedies for such serious ills." He obviously thought that the few aristocrats were bankers like himself. At this stage, though, he was the one building castles in the air. His notion that the world's central bankers would not be subject to the same nationalistic pressures to which politicians were also responding was curiously naive. His vision of a league of the lords of world finance was at this stage largely a pipe dream. He could not even get Strong to support him fully. After the Genoa Economic Conference of 1922, he floated the idea of a grand conclave of central bankers. But Strong resisted the idea, fearing that the United States, as the world's major creditor, would be ambushed by a concert of its European debtors, all clamoring for America with its vast gold reserves to refloat them. As he wrote to Norman, anything in the nature of a league or alliance, with world conditions as they are, is necessarily filled with peril. It would, he feared, be like handing a blank check to some of the impoverished nations of the world, or to their banks of issue, and especially to those whose finances are in complete disorder and quite beyond control. By 1923, Norman's club consisted essentially of himself and Strong, commiserating with each other over their respective health problems and the economic anarchy that seemed to surround them. Their friendship, however, had blossomed. After Norman's 3 trips to the United States in 1921 and 1922, they did not see each other again for almost 18 months. Falling ill once more, Strong had to take a leave of absence for most of 1923. Thereafter, they agreed to meet at least twice a year, alternating generally between Europe in the summer and New York in the winter. They wrote to each other every few weeks, a combination of financial gossip and views about economic policy. Despite their closeness, they usually addressed each other, in the quaintly formal style of the day, as Dear Strong or Dear Norman, although letting their hair down on occasion with Dear Strongy, Dear Old Man, or Dear Old Thma. They furnished each other with advice, often revealing confidential details to which even their own colleagues were not privy. Occasionally they scolded each other, when Norman operated too much on his own and failed to consult his own directors. Strong admonished him, "You are a dear queer old duck, and one of my duties seems to be to lecture you now and then." It was not all about work. They often ribbed each other affectionately. On one occasion, Norman, who had just returned from a visit to Strong in New York and discovered that he had packed one of Strong's jackets by mistake, wrote, "Dear Ben, since I wrote on the steamer, a further crime has been discovered. The second evening I was home. As usual, I changed clothes in the evening, and on going downstairs discovered myself in the disguise of a gentleman, if not a dude. This was due to velvet jacket of good style, fit and finish. In other words, Ben, I can only look respectable with the help of your wardrobe." At times, they sounded like a couple of harmless old bachelors who took great pleasure in joshing each other. Whether over an oil portrait of Strong upon which Norman had stumbled in the pages of Town and Country, or Norman's irritability when Thorpe Lodge was under repair, or his engagement with the philosophy of Spinoza. Norman, by nature the more emotional, could be gushing and sentimental and fussed over his friend's health. Let me beg you to care for yourself more than you seem to be doing. You belong to others quite as much as to yourself, he wrote after a 1921 visit to New York. He lectured strong about smoking too many camels and insisted on details about what is happening to your pulse and by 1923, they were seriously fearing for the future. The first few years of peace, begun so hopefully, had turned out to be a time of great frustration and disappointment for both. The United States had washed its hands of European affairs and retreated into isolation. Currencies in Europe remained unstable. Neither of them could do much about the failures of economic policy in Germany or France, both paralyzed by reparations. Germany refusing to do anything to stabilize its economy until a fairer settlement was established. France in its turn insisting that it could make no concessions until a deal was reached on its war debts to Britain and America. Norman saw the civilization of Europe at stake. But all he could do was watch gloomily from the sidelines as matters continued to deteriorate. He became increasingly pro-German and anti-French. French obstinacy during the reparations dispute only served to reinforce his private prejudices, particularly against the French political class, which in his view was uniformly venal, underhanded, corrupt, and dishonorable. The black spot of Europe and the world continues to be on the Rhine, he wrote to Strong after the occupation of the Ruhr. There you have all the conditions of war except that one side is unarmed. How long can Germany continue thus? For Strong, the frustrations were more personal. Though he remained financially comfortable, over the years he had to adjust his lifestyle drastically. The contrast between his relatively modest way of living and those of his old colleagues in the private sector could not have been more apparent. Following his separation and divorce, he lived in a series of small apartments, initially in a suite at the Plaza Hotel, and from mid-1922, in a small two-bedroom apartment in Midtown Manhattan. Harry Davison had the benefit of a mansion on Park Avenue, a 60-acre estate on the north shore of Long Island, and a plantation estate in Georgia, until he died suddenly of a brain tumor in May 1922. Meanwhile, Thomas Lamont, the embodiment to Strong of the road not taken, lived in a large townhouse at 70th Street and Park Avenue, continued to use his property in Englewood during the spring, and summered on his estate in North Haven, Maine. Strong continued to be plagued by illness. In February 1923, the tuberculosis spread to his larynx, forcing him to take yet another extended leave of absence in Colorado, his fourth in 7 years, from which he returned to work in October, and then only part-time. Since he had first contracted the disease in 1916, he had spent almost half the time away from his desk. Even when he was nominally at work, he was often incapacitated, afflicted by the generous use of morphine to control the terrible pain. He had aged enormously. Compelled to give up tennis and other vigorous exercise, he had put on weight and was losing his hair. He looked haggard and overworked, almost unrecognizable from the tall, slim, confident, good-looking young man of 10 years earlier. In those days, even after his first wife's death, he had always been very social and clubby. Now he rarely went out at night and was never seen at the theater or the opera. His job was his anodyne, his evenings devoted to quiet working dinners with other bankers and officials. In early 1924, with both his sons talking of getting married, he wrote to Norman, "The temptation is constantly before me to wind up my work and quit, do some traveling, a little writing, and take things easy." Neither of them foresaw that after 4 years of frustration, they were on the verge of achieving their goals. 9. A barbarous relic. The gold standard. Time will run back and fetch the age of gold. John Milton, on the morning of Christ's nativity. After the war, there was a universal consensus among bankers that the world must return to the gold standard as quickly as possible. The almost theological belief in gold as the foundation for money was so embedded in their thinking, so much a part of their mental equipment for framing the world, that few could see any other way to organize the international monetary system. Leading that quest were Montague Norman and Benjamin Strong. The biggest obstacle to such a return was the mountain of paper currency issued by the central banks of the belligerent powers during the war. Take Britain, for example. In 1913, the total amount of money circulating in the country, gold and silver coins, Notes issued by the Bank of England and by the large commercial banks, in the largest category, bank deposits, amounted to the equivalent of $5 billion. This supply of money, in all its various forms, was backed in aggregate by the country's $800 million of gold, surprisingly only $150 million of which was held in the vaults of the Bank of England, the remainder consisting of gold coins in circulation or bullion held by the commercial banks, such as Barclays or Midland. By 1920, the Bank of England had lent so much money to the government to help pay for the war effort that the total money supply had ballooned to the equivalent of $12 billion, which in turn had driven prices up by 2.5 times. Britain's gold reserves, meanwhile, remained roughly the same. Thus, whereas in 1913, there had been 15 cents worth of gold within the country for every $1 in money, in 1920 each $1 of money was backed by less than 7 cents. The Bank of England made every effort to economize on gold, for example, by replacing gold coins with paper currency and by concentrating the bullion originally held by commercial banks into its own holdings. Nevertheless, at war's end it was clear that the country's reserves would not provide enough of a monetary cushion for Britain to contemplate returning to gold at the old 1914 exchange rate. Every nation involved in the war, even the United States, faced the same dilemma, for all had resorted to inflationary finance to a greater or lesser degree. There were essentially only two ways to restore the past balance between the value of gold reserves and the total money supply. One was to put the whole process of inflation into reverse and deflate the monetary bubble by actually contracting the amount of currency in circulation. This was the path of redemption, but it was painful, for it inescapably involved a period of dramatically tight credit and high interest rates, a move that was almost bound to lead to recession and unemployment, at least until prices were forced down. The alternative was to accept that past mistakes were now irreversible and re-establish monetary balance with a sweep of the pen by reducing the value of the domestic currency in terms of gold. In other words, formally devalue the currency. This sounds painless, but to a generation reared on the certainties of the gold standard, devaluation was viewed as a disguised form of expropriation, a way of cheating investors and creditors out of the true value of their savings, which to some degree it was. Moreover, it was not completely costless. Central banks that resorted to devaluation as a way of cleaning up a past monetary mess were viewed as the financial equivalent of reformed alcoholics. It was hard to clear the stain on their reputations for financial discipline, and as a consequence, they generally had to pay up to borrow. A simple analogy of the choice between deflation and devaluation might be that of the man who has put on weight and is having a hard time fitting into his clothes. He can either choose to lose the weight, that is, deflate, or alternatively accept that his larger waistline is now irreversible and have his clothes altered, that is, devalue. Whether to deflate or devalue became the central economic decision for every country after the war. The burden of deflation fell on workers, businesses, and borrowers, that of devaluation on savers. The fate of the world economy would hinge over the next 2 decades on which path each country took. The United States and Britain took the route of deflation, Germany and France that of devaluation. Of all the belligerents, the United States, having come late to the war and having spent the least of any of the major powers, was in the best financial shape. Though it, too, had allowed its currency to expand by 250% during the war and prices to double, it also had seen its gold reserves more than double as the enormous European purchases of war materials and the massive flight of European capital seeking safety across the Atlantic carried over $2 billion worth of gold into the United States. By 1920, the country held close to $4 billion in gold. Even allowing for war inflation, therefore, it still had a comfortable reserve of bullion to back its expanded currency base, and was able to return to the gold standard almost immediately after hostilities ceased. Even in the United States, the return to gold and monetary stability was not completely painless. In 1919 and 1920, after the years of wartime austerity, consumers let rip and went on a buying binge. Inflation began to accelerate and for a brief moment, seemed about to spin out of control. Strong reacted forcefully, leading a move by the Fed to tighten credit policy dramatically by raising interest rates to 7% and keeping them there for a full year. This constriction was accompanied by a similar move by the federal government to bring its budget into balance. The economy plunged into recession. Over 2.5 million men lost their jobs. Bankruptcies soared. But by the end of 1921, with prices down by almost a third, the economy once again began to recover. During the next 7 years, the U.S. economy, led by new technologies, such as automobiles and communications, would experience an unprecedented period of strong growth and low inflation. At the opposite end of the spectrum from the United States was Germany, which had taken the path of least resistance during the war and expanded its money supply by 400%. By the end of 1920, German prices stood at 10 times their 1913 level. Germany had issued so much currency that it had no hope of being able to reverse the process, and when the war ended, seemed clearly headed for a massive devaluation. In retrospect, that would have been a blessing. But instead of trying to rebuild its finances, the German government adopted a policy of systematic inflation, in part to meet reparations, and thus launched itself on that voyage of fantasy into the outer realms of the monetary universe. Britain and France lay somewhere in between. During the war, France had expanded its currency by 350%, pushing up prices equivalently. After the war, the Banque de France avoided German-style hyperinflation and currency collapse by putting a lid on the issue of new currency. However, France continued to flirt with disaster by running budget deficits of $500 million and was saved once again only by the remarkable thriftiness of its people. While there was a group within the Banque who harbored the fantasy of reversing the more than threefold price increase and returning the franc to gold at its pre-war parity, most rational observers agreed that when France returned to the gold standard, it would have to be at a radically lower exchange rate, and even that still seemed many years away. Britain was therefore the only major country that truly faced the choice between devaluation and deflation. To a modern observer, less wedded to the principle that currency rates are sacrosanct, some measure of devaluation would have made sense. After all, Britain was finding it harder to compete in the post-war world economy and, having liquidated vast amounts of its holdings abroad, could only draw upon a much reduced foreign income to cushion the blow. Its exchange rate should have been allowed to fall as a means of making its goods cheaper on world markets. However, Norman and his generation lived in a different mental world. They saw devaluation not as an adjustment to a new reality, but as something more, a symptom of financial indiscipline that might precipitate a collective loss of confidence in all currencies. When people talked of the City of London as banker to the world, this was no mere figure of speech. The city operated literally like a gigantic bank, taking deposits from one part of the world and lending to another. While gold was the international currency par excellence, the pound sterling was viewed as its closest substitute in most trading nations: the United States, Russia, Japan, India, Argentina, even kept part of their cash reserves in sterling deposits in London. The pound had a special status in the gold standard constellation, and its devaluation would have rocked the financial world. In the last months of the war, the British government set up a commission, chaired by the ubiquitous Lord Cunliffe, only recently departed from the Bank of England, and including Sir John Bradbury of the UK Treasury, A.C. Pigou, Professor of Political Economy at Cambridge, and 10 bankers from the city, to review post-war currency arrangements. 23 parties gave evidence before the commission, every one of them, with not single note of dissent, in favor of a return to gold at the pre-war rate. To a man, they believed the restoration of the traditional parity was essential if Britain was to retain its position at the hub of the world's banking system. The model they had in mind, which was especially seared into the collective memory of the Bank of England, was Britain's experience a century earlier after the Napoleonic Wars. In 1797, 4 years into the Revolutionary War with France, there was a run on the Bank of England, provoked by rumors that a French army had landed in Wales. The bank, which had begun the war with gold reserves of £9 million, saw them shrink to £1 million and was forced, as it would be in 1914, to abandon the gold standard. Under the pressures of war finance, Bank of England notes, which formed the basis for paper money in the country, increased over the next 15 years from £10 million to over £22 million, doubling prices. In 1810, a parliamentary inquiry known as the Bullion Committee was formed to examine the whole issue. The committee included Henry Thornton, a banker, parliamentarian, brother to a director of the Bank of England, and the most creative monetary economist of the 19th century, whose insights would unfortunately be lost by succeeding generations in charge at the bank. The committee recommended that the bank resume gold payments as soon as possible, and in order to achieve this goal, begin to contract its credits to banks and merchants, and shrink the supply of paper money by withdrawing its notes from circulation. The bank wisely waited until 1815, when a defeated Napoleon was safely in exile on St. Helena, before taking this advice. Over the next 6 years, it almost halved the supply of paper money in Britain, driving down prices by 50%. And though those years from 1815 to 1821 had been years of riots and agricultural distress, Britain went back on gold in 1821. Over the subsequent half-century, it transformed itself into the world's largest economic power. Many believe that the resumption of 1821 had been the single most important defining decision in its financial history. That the bank had been willing to inflict the pain of a 50% fall in prices in order to restore the gold value of the pound had set sterling apart from every other currency in Europe and made it the world's premier store of value. Inspired by this example, and in complete contrast to every other European country, in 1920, the Bank of England chose the path of deflation, matching the Fed and raising interest rates to 7%. The budget was balanced. The economy plunged into sharp recession. 2 million men were thrown out of work. Nevertheless, by the end of 1922, the bank had succeeded in bringing prices down by 50%, and the pound, which had fallen as low as $3.20 in the foreign exchange market on the fear that Britain was headed for devaluation, climbed back to within 10% of its pre-war parity of $4.86. But whereas the U.S. economy, more dynamic and unhampered by a large internal debt, was quickly able to bounce back from the recession, Britain remained stuck. The number of unemployed would not fall below 1 million for the next 20 years. It soon became apparent that Britain had sustained terrible damage as an economic power during the war. Industries such as cotton, coal, and shipbuilding, in which it had once led the world, had failed to modernize, and the traditional markets had been lost to competitors. Labor costs had risen as unions negotiated shorter working hours. Norman now faced the uneasy prospect that the only way to follow the example set by his forerunners, his grandfather joined the court the year of resumption, was by keeping unemployment high. But while before the war it might have been politically acceptable to create unemployment deliberately in order to support the currency, in the charged climate after the war, with Lloyd George promising the electorate a land fit for heroes, Norman would find himself constantly under pressure to find an alternative. The problem of resurrecting the gold standard went much deeper than selecting new exchange rates for the key currencies, for the war had brought about such a tectonic shift in the distribution of gold reserves that it seemed to threaten the very viability of a monetary system resting on gold. Before the war, the four largest economies, the United States, Britain, Germany, and France, had operated their monetary systems with about $5 billion worth of gold among them. The amount of new gold mined during the war was small, and by 1923, monetary gold had increased only to $6 billion. Meanwhile, prices in the United States and the UK, even after the post-war deflation, were still 50% higher than before the war, which meant that in effect the real purchasing power of gold reserves had contracted by almost 25%. In 1922, Norman worked with officials at the British Treasury to develop a plan whereby some of the European central banks would, as did many countries in the British Empire, hold pounds rather than gold as their reserve asset, in much the same way that many central banks hold dollars nowadays. He argued that substituting pounds for gold would allow the world to economize on the precious metal and thus reduce the risk of worldwide shortage. Few people failed to notice that by creating a captive source of demand for sterling, the plan would add to its privileged position in the constellation of currencies and greatly ease his job of returning the pound to gold. The plan never really did take off, except in a few minor Central European countries. The bigger concern among bankers after the war was not so much that the world was short of gold, but that too much of the gold was concentrated in the United States. Before the war, there had been some parity among the major economic powers between the amount of gold in each banking system and the size of its economy. For example, the United States, with a GDP of $40 billion, accounted for about half the output of the four great economic powers and held about $2 billion in gold, a little less than half of the total gold of these four countries. The balance was only rough and ready. France held proportionately more and Britain less, but the system worked with remarkable smoothness. By 1923, the United States had accumulated close to $4.5 billion of the $6 billion in gold reserves of the four major economic powers, far in excess of what it needed to sustain its economy. About $400 million circulated in the form of coins. The remainder consisted of ingots, small bars the size of a quart of milk, each weighing about 25 pounds, stored in the vaults of the Federal Reserve Banks and the Treasury. The largest hoard lay under Lower Manhattan, about $1.5 billion in the Treasury Repository at the legendary intersection of Broad and Wall Streets, and at the New York Federal. The remainder was scattered among the 11 other Federal Reserve Banks across the country. 20 by 1 estimate, excess gold reserves in the United States amounted to about a third of its holdings, roughly $1.5 billion. While the U.S. monetary system was swamped by this enormous surplus, Europe, particularly Britain and Germany, suffered a chronic shortage. The three big European economies, which had operated before the war on $3 billion worth of gold, were left with barely half that. Faced with constant demands to pay out gold, European central banks had resorted to a complex of measures, the most important being to withdraw gold coins from circulation. All those solid talismans of turn-of-the-century middle-class prosperity had gradually disappeared from Europe's pockets to be replaced by shabby pieces of paper. By the mid-1920s, the United States was the only large country where one could still find gold coins. The concentration of the world's key precious metal in the United States had left the rest of the world with insufficient reserves to grease the machinery of trade. The world of the international gold standard had become like a poker table at which one player has accumulated all the chips, and the game simply cannot get back into play. One man who had no difficulty liberating himself from the strictures of the gold standard was John Maynard Keynes. After the peace conference, he had gone back to teaching at Cambridge. But following the resounding success of the economic consequences of the peace, he reduced his involvement with the university and became increasingly caught up on the grander stage of world affairs. He joined the board of an insurance company and became chairman of the weekly British magazine The Nation, for which he wrote regular pieces, as he did for the Manchester Guardian, articles that were syndicated around the world, including in the US. Weekly The New Republic. And he began making his fortune as a currency speculator. In 1919, it was a novel way of making money. Before 1914, currencies had been fixed, and opportunities to profit from the instability of exchange rates had been almost non-existent. In the aftermath of the war, as exchange rates of the major currencies lurched up and down, it became possible to make large returns, and also lose equally large amounts, by betting on the direction of such moves. In the latter half of 1919, convinced that the inflationary consequences of the war would undermine the currencies of the main belligerents, Keynes went short on the French franc, the German Reichsmark, and the Italian lira, buying the currencies of countries that had sat out most of the war: the Norwegian and the Danish kroner, the US dollar, and interestingly enough, the Indian rupee. He made $30,000 in the first few months. In early 1920, he set up a syndicate, with his brother, some of the Bloomsbury Circle, and a financier friend from the city of London. By the end of April 1920, they had made a further $80,000. Suddenly, in the space of 4 weeks, a spasm of optimism about Germany briefly drove the declining European currencies back up, wiping out their entire capital. Keynes found himself on the verge of bankruptcy and had to be bailed out by his tolerant father. Nevertheless, propped up by his indulgent family and by a loan from the coolly acute financier Sir Ernest Cassel, he persevered in his speculations, built for the most part around the view that the German and Central European currencies were headed for disaster. By the end of 1922, he had amassed a modest nest egg of close to $120,000. But by far the most important development in his life was that he had fallen in love, this time with a woman, Lydia Lopakova, a married Russian émigré ballerina, no less, the daughter of a Russian father, an usher at the Imperial Alexandrinsky Theatre, and a Scottish-German mother. Lydia came from a family of dancers. Her two brothers and a sister had also gone to the Imperial Ballet School in St. Petersburg. When Maynard met her in 1918, she was traveling with the Dyatlov Ballet, having spent 7 years in the United States as a cabaret artist, model, and vaudeville performer, and was married to the business manager of the company, Randolfo Barocci. After her marriage broke down, she disappeared into Russia, then in the thick of civil war, with a mysterious white Russian general, but reappeared in Keynes's life at the end of 1921. Though they would not get married until 1925 when her divorce finally came through, they began living together in 1923. They made an unlikely couple. He a brilliant and all too cerebral intellectual with a genius for exposition, she an unpredictable artist with a risque past, a flighty and vivacious chatterbox with an equal skill for stumbling into the most memorable malapropisms. She once complained that she disliked being in the country in August, because my legs get so bitten by barristers. On another occasion, after visiting an aviary, she remarked on her hostess's ovary. And though the rest of Bloomsbury looked down on her, Keynes was to remain completely enchanted with her for the rest of his life. In December 1923, Keynes published a short monograph, a tract on monetary reform, much of which had already appeared as a series of articles in the Manchester Guardian during 1922 and early 1923, his first systematic attempt to unravel the sources and consequences of the chronic monetary instability that plagued the post-war world. Like his earlier book, a tract was a strange hybrid, this time a half-theoretical treatise, with sections on the theory of purchasing power parity and the forward market in exchanges and half-pamphlet for the laity. It was, however, very different in tone from the economic consequences. That had been an angry, passionate work, written in the heat of debate and controversy. This one had a lighter touch, a tentative, almost diffident tone, as if the author himself were searching for the answer to the quest for monetary stability. Before the war, however much he had enjoyed challenging conventional nostrums about morality, conduct, and society, in economics Keynes had fully embraced the liberal orthodoxy that dominated his still nascent profession. He believed in free trade, in the unfettered mobility of capital, and in the virtues of the gold standard. There were times when, like so many other economists, he might speculate whether gold was the right foundation for money. But those had been largely theoretical ruminations, and ultimately, when it came down to it, there seemed no other practical basis so tried and tested upon which to organize the world's currencies. Asked at the height of the 1914 crisis to brief the Chancellor of the Exchequer as to whether the pound should remain tied to gold, he had come down very strongly in favor of maintaining the link. London's position as a monetary center depends very directly on complete confidence in London's unwavering readiness to meet its obligations in gold and would be severely damaged if, at the first sign of emergency, that commitment was suspended. Even during the first years after the war, he was still advocating a return to gold. But the shift in the world's economic landscape was beginning to give him doubts. He still believed that the prime goal of central bank policy should be to keep prices broadly stable. But whereas before the war he had thought that the best way to achieve this was to ensure that currencies such as the pound be fully convertible to gold at a fixed value, he had now come to believe that there was no reason why linking money supply and credit to gold should necessarily result in stable prices. The gold standard had only worked in the late 19th century because new mining discoveries had fortuitously kept pace with economic growth. There was no guarantee that this accident of history would continue. Moreover, while the original rationale for a gold standard, the commitment that paper money could be converted into something unequivocally tangible, might have been necessary to instill confidence at some point in history, this was no longer the case. Attitudes toward paper money had evolved, and it was not necessary to allow the supply of precious metals to regulate the creation of credit in a sophisticated modern economy. Central banks were perfectly capable of managing their country's monetary affairs rationally and responsibly, he argued, without any need to shackle themselves to this barbarous relic. Though the tract was a technical monograph, the Cambridge undergraduate in Keynes could not resist lacing the book with the playful sarcasms that had made the economic consequences such a success. He flippantly dedicated the book, humbly and without permission, to the governors and the court of the Bank of England, knowing very well that the members of that august body would disagree with almost everything he had to say. He poked fun at the self-importance of those conservative bankers who regard it as more consonant with their cloth, and also as economizing on thought, to shift public discussion of financial topics off the logical onto an alleged moral plane, which means a realm of thought where vested interest can be triumphant over the common good without further debate. And he peppered it with the sort of bones mots, the most famous being "in the long run we are all dead," that made him so scintillating a conversationalist. But more than anything else, it was Keynes's ability to strip away the surface of monetary phenomena and reveal some of its deeper realities and its connections to the society at large that has made the tract such an enduring classic. For example, by tracing through the consequences of rising prices on different classes in a stylized picture of the economy, what economists today might call a model, he showed that inflation was much more than simply prices going up, but also a subtle mechanism for transferring wealth between social groups, from savers, creditors, and wage earners to the government, debtors, and businessmen. He thus highlighted the fact that the post-war inflation in countries such as France and Germany was not just the result of an error in monetary policy. Rather, it was a symptom of the fundamental disagreement that had racked European society since the war about how to share the accumulated financial burden of that terrible conflict. In contrast to the economic consequences, the new book had almost no practical impact. At a time when the currencies of Central Europe had completely collapsed and the franc was perilously close to the edge, few people could be convinced to entrust the management of national monies and currency values to the discretion of treasury mandarins, politicians, or central bankers. There were too many examples to point to: Germany, Austria, Hungary, admittedly some of them pathologically extreme, of what could happen when the discipline of gold was removed. But the experience of the next decade would, in the words of one of Keynes's biographers, win for the tract the allegiance of half the world. Norman's response to the tract was predictably to dismiss it as the froth of a clever dilettante. As he wrote to Strong, "For the moment Mr. Keynes seems to have rather outdone himself, a fact that perhaps comes from his trying to combine the position of financial mentor to this and other countries with that of a high-class speculator." What separated Norman from Keynes had less to do with economics and more to do with philosophy and worldview. For Norman, the gold standard was not simply a convenient mechanism for regulating the money supply, the efficiency of which was an empirical question. He thought about it in much more existential terms. It was one of the pillars of a free society, like property rights or habeas corpus, which had evolved in the Western liberal world to limit the power of government, in this case its power to debase money. Without such a discipline to protect them, central banks would inevitably come under constant pressure to help finance their governments in much the same way that they had done during the war, with all the inflationary consequences that were still all too apparent. The link with gold was the only sure defense against such a downward spiral in the value of money. His reaction to the tract was colored by his personal dealings with Keynes. After the war, Norman, agreeing with much of Keynes's argument on reparations, had consulted him at the height of the German hyperinflation. But Keynes's vocal opposition to the war debt settlement with the United States, which Norman had been responsible for engineering, created a rift. Norman, acutely sensitive to public criticism, harbored grudges for a long time. "The most vindictive man I have ever known," according to one close friend. Thereafter, though their social circles overlapped somewhat and though Keynes, for all his youthful iconoclasm, was already widely recognized as the most brilliant monetary economist of his generation, Norman studiously ignored him professionally and refused ever to invite him to advise the bank. Strong's reactions were on the surface similar to Norman's. He had never met Keynes, but given his Puritan background, he would have vehemently disapproved of the Bloomsbury irreverence and mockery of authority. When the economic consequences came out, he had written of Keynes, "He is a brilliant but, I fear, somewhat erratic chap, with great power for good and, unfortunately, some capacity for harm." Many in his circle had taken offense at Keynes's merciless lampooning of Woodrow Wilson at the Peace Conference. He echoed this again in his reaction to the tract. Keynes' little book arrived safely and I am just now reading it. He wrote to Norman on January 4, 1924, from the Arizona desert. I have a great respect for his ability and the freshness and versatility of his mind, but I am much afraid of some of his more erratic ideas, which impressed me as being the product of a vivid imagination without very much practical experience. The hidden irony was that every one of Keynes's main recommendations, that the link between gold balances and the creation of credit be severed, that the automatic mechanism of the gold standard be replaced with a system of managed money, that credit policy be geared toward domestic price stability, corresponded precisely to the policy Strong had instituted in the United States. During the war, the flow of gold into the United States had pushed up prices by 60%. When the fighting ended, but turmoil in Europe continued and the gold still kept arriving, Strong decided that it was time to abandon the conventional rules of the gold standard and insulate the U.S. economy from the flood of bullion. The system was being swamped by so much excess gold that to have followed the traditional dictates of the gold standard would have led to a massive expansion of domestic credit, which inevitably would have led to very high rates of inflation. Strong calculated that it would cause prices to double. It made no sense to him for the United States to import, in effect, the inflationary policies of Europe and destabilize its own monetary system just because the old world had been hit by political and financial disaster. The Fed therefore began to short-circuit the effects of additional gold on the money supply by contracting the amount of credit that it supplied to banks, thus offsetting any liquidity from. Having jettisoned the simple operating procedures of the gold standard, which linked credit creation solely to gold reserves, Strong began to improvise an alternative set of principles to guide monetary policy. The Fed's primary goal should be, he believed, to try to stabilize domestic prices. But he thought that it should also respond to fluctuations in business activity. In other words, the Fed should try to fine-tune the economy by opening the spigot of credit when commercial conditions were weakening and closing it as the economy strengthened. This new set of principles, somewhat cobbled together on the fly, represented a quiet, indeed carefully unheralded, revolution in monetary policy. Until then, central bankers had seen their primary task as protecting the currency and confined their responsibilities to ensuring that the gold standard was given free rein, only stepping in at times of crisis or panic. The credit policy of every industrial country had been driven by one factor alone: gold reserves. The United States was, however, now so flush with gold that the solidity of its currency was assured. Led by Strong, the Fed had undertaken a totally new responsibility, that of promoting internal economic stability. It was Strong more than anyone else who invented the modern central banker. When we watch Ben Bernanke or, before him, Alan Greenspan or Jean-Claude Trichet or Mervyn King describe how they are seeking to strike the right balance between economic growth and price stability, it is the ghost of Benjamin Strong who hovers above him. It all sounds quite prosaically obvious now, but in 1922 it was a radical departure from more than 200 years of central banking history. Strong's policy of offsetting the impact of gold inflows on domestic credit conditions meant that as bullion came into the United States, it was, in effect, withdrawn from circulation. It was as if all this treasure that had been so painfully mined from the depths of the earth was being reburied. Strong's policy contained a fundamental contradiction. On the one hand, he advocated a worldwide return to the international gold standard. On the other, he was doing things that not only undermined the doctrine he claimed most to believe in, but also, by preventing the gold from being recycled to Europe, he was making it all the more difficult for Europe to contemplate rejoining America on the gold standard. It was a dilemma he was never able to resolve. European bankers argued that the massive bullion imbalance between their countries and the United States was a fundamental problem for the world and pressed for some mechanism to recycle some of this gold. "I do not intend another quarter to pass," wrote Norman to Strong in January 1924, "without seeing you face to face and asking you how in the name of heaven the Federal Reserve System and the United States Treasury are going to use their gold reserves." Keynes was the first to recognize and articulate that, for all the public rhetoric about reinstating the gold standard, the new arrangements were in fact very different from the hallowed and automatic pre-war mechanism. As he put it in the tract, a dollar standard was set up on the pedestal of the golden calf. For the past 2 years, the U.S. has pretended to maintain a gold standard. In fact, it has established a dollar standard. It meant, in effect, that the Federal Reserve was so flush with gold that it had gone from being the central bank of the United States to being the central bank of the entire industrial world. Keynes's main concern was that Britain and other major European countries would find themselves being dictated to by a Fed that focused primarily on the needs of the domestic U.S. economy, yoking the gold-starved Europeans to U.S. credit policy. Strong was in the process of constructing a one-leg gold standard, whose European limb would be firmly tied to classical rules while the American limb would be run by the Fed according to its own set of goals and constraints. Keynes would have been even more horrified had he probed further into how the Fed operated and the character of the men who ran it. The Federal Reserve Act of 1913 had been a political compromise. Decisions about the level of interest rates and credit conditions were vested in the hands of the 12 banker-dominated regional reserve banks. This network was overseen by an 8-member Central Board of Governors, all presidential appointees based in Washington. Broadly speaking, only the reserve banks could initiate policies, but these policies had to be approved by the board. It was not surprising that there should have been a certain amount of jockeying for control within the system. The precise locus of authority was ambiguous, and too many big egos. 12 governors of the reserve banks, the 6 political appointees on the Federal Reserve Board, the Secretary of the Treasury and the Comptroller of the Currency, both ex officio members of the board, were jostling for power. From the start, the board in Washington was an organization of unclear purpose and mandate. When it was created in 1913, Wilson conceived of it as a regulatory agency standing as a watchdog over the various regional reserve banks. He believed, therefore, that it should be comprised of individuals from outside banking, but he was unwilling to give it much stature. When the first governors of the board complained to the president that the State Department expert on protocol had decided that as the most recently created of the government agencies, they should come last in social precedence, Wilson had replied that as far as he was concerned, they might come right after the fire department. The board did not even have its own quarters, but operated from a dark and dreary suite of offices on the top floor of the Treasury building, from which its long and narrow boardroom overlooked the grimy interior court. Members' salaries were typical of the civil service, considerably lower than private sector compensation and even much less than the pay of the governors of the regional Federal Reserve banks. Not surprisingly, the board found it hard to attract good people. On one occasion, 6 different candidates turned down an offer of a position before someone could be induced to accept. As a result, the board was, in J.K. Galbraith's description, a body of startling incompetence. In 1923, the chairman was Daniel Crissinger. Born in a log cabin in Marion, Ohio, he was a local eminence, a lawyer and banker who had risen to the position of general counsel of the Marion Steam Shovel Company and had twice run for Congress, albeit unsuccessfully. He also had the fortune to have been one of Warren Harding's boyhood chums and, though by all accounts utterly devoid of global or economic banking sense, was appointed comptroller of the currency in 1922 after his old friend had become president. The following year, the president elevated him to the chair of the board. Besides its chairman and its 2 ex officio members, the board comprised 5 other governors, carefully selected not for their expertise, but to ensure due representation for the different regions of the country. From Memphis, Tennessee, came George Rusa James, a dry goods merchant, a man of great energy, something of a diamond in the rough. His economic ideas, however, ran on the eccentric side. Firmly rooted in the past, he held that the basic foundation of the economy lay with the horse, the mule, and hay, and that the decay of the nation had begun with the advent of the automobile. From Iowa came Edward Cunningham, who had started life as a dirt farmer and gone on to become Speaker of the Iowa legislature. From Poughkeepsie, New York, came Edmund Platt, a local newspaper publisher, who had entered politics as a member of the town's Board of Water Commissioners and gone on to serve as its 3-term Republican congressman. Boston furnished George Hamlin, longest-serving of the governors, having been appointed chairman by Woodrow Wilson in 1914. By profession a lawyer, he had run unsuccessfully for governor of Massachusetts in 1902 and 1910, A failed political career, it seems, was not an impediment, indeed was almost a qualification for board membership. One member, however, who could legitimately claim some relevant expertise was Dr. Adolf Miller. Having studied economics at Harvard, he had been a professor at the University of California at Berkeley for 25 years. A deeply insecure man, he resented that his qualifications were not fully appreciated by his colleagues. They in turn tended to dismiss him as an ivory tower theoretician with no practical experience. He liked to argue, and when his colleagues grew weary of the interminable wrangling, would begin to argue with himself. Not surprisingly, he was often confused and indecisive, with a tendency to adopt extremely dogmatic but contradictory positions on many topics. He had also developed a particular animus against Strong, resenting the younger man's influence and authority. It did not help that Miller had learned his economics at a time when monetary economics, as a discipline, was very much in its infancy, thus leading him to espouse a series of outmoded beliefs about the way monetary policy was supposed to work. Among these was the now-defunct doctrine of real bills, that as long as the Federal Reserve and commercial banks restricted themselves to providing only short-term credit to finance inventories, nothing much could go wrong. Faced with overseers such as this, it was not surprising that Strong was able to step into the vacuum of leadership and dominate the institution. Unlike his nominal superiors, he made a concerted attempt, particularly during those many trips to Europe, to educate himself about central banking. It was he, for example, who was most responsible for introducing the biggest innovation in the way the Fed operated, so-called open market operations. When the Fed was conceived, it was assumed that it would primarily influence credit conditions by changes in its discount rate, the interest rate it charged on loans to member banks. By the early 1920s, this technique was proving to be too passive, depending, as it did, for its impact on how much or how little bankers were willing to borrow at the discount window. Strong recognized that by buying or selling government securities from its portfolio, the Fed could directly and immediately alter the quantity of money flowing through the banking system. It was inevitable that control of open market operations should become the object of an intense power struggle. The purchase and sale of securities out of their portfolios had initially been left to the reserve banks, but in 1923, the board, recognizing the potency of the new tool, tried to take charge by requiring the committee that made these decisions to operate under its umbrella. Strong was away in Colorado at the time, recuperating from his bout of tuberculosis of the throat. He was furious. "I'll see them damned before I'd be dismissed by that timid bunch," he wrote to one of his fellow governors. Eventually, though, he did acquiesce in giving the board oversight over such operations. But as the most knowledgeable official on the new Open Market Committee, he was easily able to call the shots on virtually all decisions. In the process, he stepped on a lot of toes, not concealing his impatience with the members of the board. Some complained that he had an overblown sense of his own abilities, that he was too confrontational, that he lacked judgment, particularly about people. But as the intellectual leader of the Federal Reserve, he had acquired a large following within the organization and was worshipped by the younger men. If there was one problem with this whole process of making monetary policy, it was that it all depended too heavily on Strong, on his judgment, his skill, and his insight. He was too autocratic, operated on his own too much, and did not spend the time to build a consensus through the whole system. As a result, the rationale for many of his decisions was misinterpreted and his motives were constantly questioned. His failure to institutionalize policies and the thinking behind them meant that once he was no longer around, the Fed would become paralyzed by internal conflicts. Keynes once compared the role of the Bank of England under the pre-war system to that of the conductor of an orchestra. Even though the bank had then been administered by a club of old and established city patricians, the gold standard had been managed well, in part because circumstances were so favorable, in part because the directors of the bank, however dull and unimaginative, were solid. After the war, as the world struggled to emerge from economic chaos, with currencies still in turmoil and gold in short supply everywhere outside America, it did not bode well that the new conductor of the orchestra, the Federal Reserve, was a deeply divided organization that did not fully realize the role that had been thrust upon it and, but for Strong, would have been in the hands of a motley crew of small-town businessmen and minor league political hacks with little expertise in finance or central banking.